Morning and welcome to the 2021 Nebraska Data Users Conference Series hosted by the UNO Center for Public Affairs Research. Head to our website, cpar.unomaha.edu to learn more. I'm Josie Schaefer, the director, and I am so excited for this morning. We have some important things to talk about with you, and we are so glad you're all here. The mission of the Center for Public Affairs Research is to produce and disseminate public scholarship about topics that impact the lives of Nebraskans. In this work, one of our key partnerships is with the United States Census Bureau and that State Data Center Network. You probably heard us say that before as this lead agency in that network here in Nebraska. We try to make sure you have access to the census data you need all the time, but every 10 years is the consequential decennial census. Data from the 2020 census was recently released just days ago, and this AM presenting insights from this data will be David Drews, who I'm sure you've seen in the local news for this work, but he has even more for you today. Then we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back at the same link at 10:30 to explore the major application of 2020 census data, redistricting. We're going to be joined by Wendy Underhill, Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislature, Powerhouse, and Wayne Benna, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections for the state of Nebraska. If you don't know Deputy Secretary Benna, he's making elections fun right here in Nebraska, so we are excited to have him. Couple of things before we introduce David and get this going. We have enabled the chat feature, but we are using that to talk amongst presenters. And if you have technology issues that you want CPAR to know about, maybe there's something green in my tooth that you'd like me to know about, that's what we're going to use that chat feature for. But for questions to presenters, and you are absolutely going to have questions for this all-star lineup of presenters, we want you to use the Q&A feature. It's there at the bottom of your screen. It's called Q&A. What happens when you do that? You submit a question. I, as the moderator, will see that question, so I can make sure we are grouping like questions. We are making sure we have a robust set of questions for a great dialogue on these important topics. Get them in anytime. I will see them. I will make sure they get answered. Closed captioning is enabled, and we will be recording. Materials and recording are going to be posted to a website after the event. I'll put that in the chat now, but don't worry, if you're registered, you will also get a link to that. We do appreciate you keeping that just for those that are registered. If others would like access to the materials from today, and believe me, there's lots of great stuff in here, you can just purchase the recordings. Following your attendance today, we're going to have you complete an evaluation of your experience so UNO CPAR can continue to provide exceptional programming. I'm going to throw that in the chat here this morning. I will share it many times. We really need your feedback. Please fill that out if you get a chance. Sound good? We ready? I would like to introduce David Drews, Research Coordinator for CPAR. He works diligently to make sure media, government, and nonprofits have rich demographic data. He has been doing this work, drumroll please, for 18 years. I think that's amazing, and we appreciate it so much. His efforts for the state are just truly immeasurable in that work, which I'm sure is frustrating because he does think measurement is pretty important to that research work he does. David, thanks for being ready for us this morning.
Yes, thanks so much. It's a wonderful introduction, Josie, and I'm just really happy to be here now at conference day. There's a lot of work that goes into this, especially behind the scenes. And we're just happy you're all joining us to, at least for the start of the morning, to see some of our new 2020 census numbers. So whenever we do state and local population trends, it's usually what's new. And definitely 2020, which just came out 2 weeks ago today on August 12th, is what's new. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen and get started. Would like to note that whenever we do a presentation like this, kind of like to think of it as sitting back and watching a movie, and to see how all of these things might impact you and your work and all the advocacy and good things that you're doing throughout the day, because they do have an impact. And we'll talk a little bit about redistricting later in the morning, and that's one of the practical applications of all this information. So in today's presentation, it's first thing in the morning. We'll have to concentrate a little bit because there's a lot of information coming at you. Have a few more tables this year than almost always use a lot of graphs, but a few more tables this year to try to break down the numbers. So we'll need to pick out and find your territory, your county or city that you might be in to find that among these broader tables. So also have a lot up on our website. So let's just get started. Here's our presentation roadmap for today. So we're going to start out and talking a little bit about the census itself. How did it go in Nebraska? How did we do? And we'll see some statistics on that. Secondly, want to talk about various types of population change. We'll focus on cities and counties because that's what most people are interested in, but also a major geography of the unicameral districts that we have a picture of the state capitol here up on screen, as well as our congressional districts. And there are other types of geography for which information is available, such as school districts, but just contact me if you want to see that information or go to our website where we have some of that already displayed. Okay, then we'll, after maybe a short amount of Q&A, we'll switch gears and talk about race and ethnicity stats. That's one of the about 5 pieces of information that was released 2 weeks ago. So we now have a chance to dive into that, and there are quite a few changes there, so we'll want to bring that to your attention. And finally, another one of the key sets of information is for children, and that's something on this redistricting data set where they release it for the total population, as well as the 18 or older population for voting age. We can subtract out and see what's happening among our children. So that is important as well. Okay, so here's a little bit about the census. You can see our icon that we've had on our webpage as a census partner in the lower right part of the screen, talking about the 2020 vision for the 2020 census. And when we look at how Nebraska did, we had a very high participation rate. And that is key because as people fill out their forms, send them back to the Bureau, they provide the data, and it tends to be a little bit more accurate information than when people respond by talking to a census taker who comes to their door. There's always a little bit of a natural hesitancy to give your personal information to somebody coming to your door. So we did a great job. Our self-response ranked 4th highest in the country, about 72%. And always want to point out that when we talk about the follow-up operations of those door-to-door visits, census estimates that we did reach 99.9% of households. So it's a virtual count of everyone, and almost every state did get up to 99.9%. So even with all the challenges of being in the COVID environment, we were able to hit that high mark. Here's just the ranking of all the states that you can see regarding self-response, and Nebraska again, number 4. Generally, those states in the upper Midwest are at the top, with Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa. And so we're all kind of contiguous states that tend to be at the top, both back in 2000 and 2010 and now here in 2020. But it is key, perhaps, that we did beat Iowa, because in 2010, 10 years ago, we ranked 5th highest. So the one state that we passed was Iowa. And given that we're a border state and kind of competitive with each other, that's of course a feather in our cap. So we did very good to get self-response. A lot of partners out there. I know there's some census folks on today's Zoom. So we appreciate all their efforts, and now they're going to get to see the data from all their hard work. So we did end up exceeding our response from 2010. Part of that related to that people did have a longer time to self-respond. So typically the door-to-door enumeration starts in the May and June timeframe, but given some COVID delays, that didn't really start until August for Nebraska. So census both had additional mailings to allow for self-response. In fact, I think that was very wise. And then when people did go door to door, if somebody wasn't home, on the postcard leave behind, they did have all the information where people could go online to complete the census. So that gave them the chance to do that as a self-response and be done. And then the census taker didn't have to come back to their door. So that worked out quite well. I want to mention that it does appear in the numbers that all the types of census outreach and promotion did matter, and that we're seeing places that had better self-response came up with numbers that were also better than the population estimates. So here's a look at the top 15 counties for self-response. So in Sarpy County, almost 80% of households returned the form on their own or completed it online. And you can see how that scales down. The top 15 counties, well over 70% response. What you'll notice on this particular set of counties is that they tend to be larger, more populated areas. So there's only a couple that are below 10,000 population. And you'll see Nebraska's big three counties of Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy, where more than half our state's population resides, all are in this top list. Finally, when you look at the right-hand column, this is a peek at how the 2020 came out versus the last population estimate that the Census Bureau put out. And you can see almost all of these are in red, which I'm going to denote red throughout the presentation as kind of a hot or active area, a good response in this case. So these were all had a count that were generally above the population estimate. Only 2 of the 15 ended up slightly below their count. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular, other than it suggests that the count was good. And again, the population estimates could have been off, versus reality. And the count is really what we will rely on going forward for understanding our populations. But just look at this pattern of all these generally larger areas having a good response and then a count that exceeded their population estimate. Conversely, we see our bottom 15 counties in self-response, and here we're in the 40 to 50% range of households having responded. And there are some intricacies here. Some of these places are so rural and so remote that they have forms hand delivered to their address, to their place of residence. And some of those operations were definitely impacted by COVID. Like right after they started, about 3 days later, they had to be suspended because the Census Bureau didn't want people going out to people's residences and things like that at that time. So kind of take it with a grain of salt, but you can see how much different the response rates were here. Notice also that as opposed to the left-hand side, all of these places are very small in population size. Not one of them has more than 10,000 people, and only 2 of them have more than 5,000 people. So these are really small areas. And then in the right column, you'll see that again, here, all of these places tended to have population counts that were below their estimate. Now, again, the estimates are very difficult to do for such small populated areas, but I noticed this pattern, and again, 13 out of the 15 were below their estimate here. So juxtapose these two against each other, and it kind of creates an interesting pattern. So I wanted to delve into that just a little bit. Finally, when you look at a particular location like Lincoln, they did rank #1 for self-response among larger cities with at least 250,000 population. So given all this data, that suggests that their count should have been really good. So kudos to Lincoln and all the work that they did through the planning department and a lot of their other agencies that helped along with the count. Okay, so here's just another way to look at that same thing that I was just talking about with the relationship between the population response to the census and then the actual population count. So notice on my slides as I go through, typically I'm going to have a takeaway at the top and then a actual title on the second line down. So here comes the graph. It's what we call a scatter plot, and I'll explain to you what's going on here. So at the bottom is a look at the 2020 response versus the 2010 response. So anything on the right-hand side of the screen is going to be a better response than what we had back in 2010. And what you'll notice is that almost all of the places with better response are clustered up over here. And those are areas where the count in 2020 was better than the population estimate. So I just talked about this. So these will be the ones on the prior page that were on the left-hand side that were able to exceed their 2020 response rate. On the other hand side, we're going to see places that did not respond as high. And in this lower right, that's kind of the key section for those then that had a count that was less than their estimate. So that was kind of that relationship that we saw in a lot of the rural areas where it didn't quite meet the count. The final section, again, is that they didn't respond at quite as high a rate, but the count was better than the estimate. So it's not like this was universal or happened all the time. But we do see this generally upward sloping line here, and that indicates a relationship that as better the census response was, the better the count tended to be. So just wanted to point that out for you. If you've had some statistics, the correlation here on this particular line is about a 0.5. So it's not a super strong relationship, but it is enough to show that, you know, there was a tendency for these types of patterns to align with each other. So just wanted to share with you that math. Okay, some of the actual numbers. So we are doing really well in population growth, and you'll see here on the takeaway from the slide, our growth rate equals the US average for the first time in well over a century, back since 1900. So here's an image to represent that. I'm going to talk first about the gray bars, and those are just Nebraska's response rate. So Nebraska's population change rate. So we can see that in this latest decade, here in the 2010s, we grew by 7.4%. That is a good number. If you compare across back to all these decades, going all the way back to the 1900s, if you take out this fast growing 1990s decade, which was kind of a rebound from the low growth of the 1980s and the farm crisis when a lot of people moved out of the state, if you take out the 90s, the 2010s growth rate was the highest in 100 years, going all the way back to when it was 8.7% growth in the 1910s. So at that point in time, obviously the state had a much lower population. It was easier to have a higher percentage growth rate when the population base is smaller. So again, you can see just how well we did on a relative basis to our history in this latest 2010s decade. There was only one time point where we actually lost population in the Dust Bowl and Great Depression in the 1930s. We've had some lower growth decades, but generally we've been kind of plugging along here, solid, steady growth, and bumped up a little bit from the 2000s. The red bar is the line is the difference between Nebraska's growth rate and the US average. So for example, this -3 showing here is that the US growth was 9.7 in the 2000s, as opposed to Nebraska's 6.7. So we trailed the US growth rate by 3 percentage points. And you can see that we've always done that, trailed US growth rate back since the 1900s, was especially low back in World War II timeframe. It's trended upward, and now we actually equaled the US growth rate. Our expectation was that we would trail it slightly, so the count and our numbers came back really well. What's the implication of this? Well, it's this relative better performance that has allowed us to keep our 3 House seats in the US House of Representatives. So that is why the census is done, to divide that population equally. And this indicates that if we had not grown quite as well as we did, if we would have trailed the US growth rate by 3% again, we would have been very close to losing a congressional seat. But given this better performance, that was really not a risk. As we got to mid-decade, we could kind of see the numbers forming and that we weren't going to be at risk of losing a seat. So that's very helpful to us because it promotes our interests, a lot of rural interests, as opposed to another state such as Texas, California, or Florida, where they have a lot of coastline fishing industries, things like that are different than here in Nebraska. Okay, just a primer, and we always know that about half of our users and attendees have not been at our data conference before. So population change is really related to 4 different factors. First of all, we have births and deaths. So as people are born, that adds the population. Obviously, as people pass away, that subtracts. So that is really where the majority of our population change comes from. It's contributed about 3/4 of our growth over the past 3 decades when we've had some in-migration. But when we had out-migration, the births succeeding deaths were responsible for all of the state's growth back since the 1920s. The other way the population changes is when people move in and then people move away. Okay, so I got the picture of the family moving truck here. If you've ever had the fun of loading up boxes, you know what that's all about. So when we take a peek at this factor, it's really something that goes up and goes down depending upon a lot of different factors, both locally, nationally, and even internationally, both related to policy as well as economic conditions. So for example, in the Great Recession, 10 or 12 years ago, Nebraska's unemployment rate was so much less than the national average. There was a lot more people that stayed in the state and some people that came here for the jobs that we had available. We expect that's what's happening here in the pandemic again, but we don't really have the data yet to prove that. So anyway, this is how populations change. So here's going to be a look at the first factor, Nebraska's natural change, and have kind of a two-scaled graph here. So the level of change in the number of persons are shown in the gray bars, and then the rate of change is shown on the red line or with the red axis here. So you can see back in the 1920s, very high fertility rates, a lot of very large families, and a high natural change rate. Then in the 1930s, during the Great Depression and thereafter, this is what we kind of call the Depression cohort, lower births. People were concerned about their finances, so births did go down. But then the baby boom kind of was between the 40s and the 60s, so we can kind of see that in the pattern there, with definitely higher, over 200,000 more births than deaths back in the 1950s when the baby boom was at its peak. And then we kind of go through time, it scales down 30 years after the baby boom. Baby boomers are having their own children. So that's the millennials during the 1980s. So we see a bump up there. And we've pretty much been right around the 100,000 person growth mark from natural change in these last several decades. You can see the rate is coming down, it's slowing, and we do expect that to continue because as the population ages, baby boomers, that large population segment ages into age ranges where mortality rates kick a little bit higher. We do expect deaths to go up in the years ahead. So that's just the math, how things work. So we expect that as we move forward. The other same type of graph for net migration shows generally that the state has had outmigration all of these decades. Again, especially bad in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl, in the 1980s, where we had more than 100,000 people move out of the state, more than who moved in. So that led to some very slow population growth. But you can see we've switched around to having net in-migration these last 3 decades. That has broken this long-term trend. You can see we were barely positive in the 2000s, and our 2010 level is in between the 1990s. Again, somewhat of a rebound from all these people moving away. So some people came back to the state, as well as that's kind of when our immigration wave started. So we'll talk about that. Noting that if we were to break this chart apart by persons of color versus non-Hispanic whites, the white population has continued its outmigration trend. So these gains are solely from increases among persons of color, and we'll detail that a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, so when it comes to our census results, taking a look at the number of counties here that had population growth, okay, and then we'll break it down by component. So going back again to the 1950s and the post-World War II period, we've tended to have about, in the low 20s for the number of counties that increased in population. 24 counties grew, increased their population here in the 2010s, and that is equal to what we had in the 2000s. A few of the counties are different, but the same number grew. That's less than what we had in the 1990s and 1970s, but well above that low population growth of the 1980s. When we look at births versus deaths, there we can see back in the 1950s at the height of the baby boom, all 93 counties had more births than deaths. That trended downward, kicked up a little bit in the 80s, again, as the baby boomers had their own children, the millennial generation. So we had more births then, so that kicked that up. But lately, only about half of Nebraska's counties are having more births than deaths. So as we'll see in a minute, down over here, most counties have outmigration. So if you're not having births exceeding deaths, it's pretty much a mathematical certainty that you'll be losing population, just because we have so much outmigration. So here's our outmigration, or the net in-migration, looking at this particular piece. So we had 23 counties where more people moved in than move away. That's the positive. Okay, so I'm framing this in the positive, natural increase, net in-migration. And you can see that's up from the 2000s. Definitely not as high as the 1990s, but if you look at the average here, this was much better than an average decade for net in-migration. So that's the point, one of the takeaways, that the 2010s number of counties that were able to achieve net in-migration was higher. And we'll show you a map of that in a little bit so that you can know which counties those are. All right, So here's some of the population change rates over the last decade. Going to talk top 15 and bottom 15 Nebraska counties, kind of just what fits on the screen nicely. We do have the full tables up on our website, so you can go access them there. But here's the population growth. We see high growth, over 10%, in what we call, again, our big three counties of Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy. So Sarpy led the way, followed quickly by Buffalo and Hall counties. So this would be Kearney and Grand Island. So when you put these top 5 together, those are actually the 5 most populated counties in the state. So they had the quickest or fastest growth rates. And then you can kind of, again, look through here and see other areas of interest. But again, generally speaking, these tended to be larger locations. Only one very small county made this top 10 or 15 list. Generally speaking, all of these counties have at least 10,000 population. And again, at least the top 15 were able to grow by 3% or more. On the other side of the spectrum, we have our bottom counties. And here we have a lot of places that dropped by 10% or more over the course of the decade. And what you'll notice here again is that none of these counties have at least 10,000 population. Only Dawes County with Chadron had more than 5,000 population. So these are some very small locations. And that's the trend that we've seen the last several decades of urban growth and rural population loss. And so here's a map of the growth. So if we're in gray, that is a population loss, okay? So anything in gray is showing a lower population today than back in 2010. If you're in white or red, that's growth. So I structured this for Husker colors. So think red and white, that's good, Nebraska growth. And what you'll notice is that tends to be along the interstate, along Highway 30 back from Blair towards Columbus. So this is something that Jerry Dykert in our office would refer to as the fishhook, okay? The fishhook pattern right there, if you can see my cursor scrolling. But now, for this decade, we've had several of these counties in Northeast Nebraska become into having population growth. So now, rather than a fishhook, it's more like an S, okay? So I don't know, I can call it the S if you want. But that's kind of the shape of the pattern for our growth. And then we have one small rural county who also achieved growth out in the Sandhills. So that's what we see. Again, Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy are the only ones that exceeded 10%. So this is kind of a nice map where it breaks on round numbers, 10% growth or more, or loss of 10% or more. So again, you can see all of the counties along the southern border with Kansas in gray with population loss. And again, besides Thomas, all of the Panhandle and Sandhills area having population loss this decade. All right, here's that migration map that I referred to. So let's focus on the red first. That's the in-migration, both this decade and last decade. Again, you'll notice that tends to center around our urban areas, those big 3 counties and some of their surrounding counties that commute in to those locations for jobs and work purposes. Also see in-migration in the Kearney and Grand Island area, and one small county out west. So that's the red who had consistent in-migration. White, again, more of a positive. These are places that switched from having out-migration last decade to in-migration this decade. And we have several of those, 13 counties. You can see they're clustered along the interstate, some larger locations like Fremont and Columbus. Keith stands out for being west of Kearney, one that was able to switch from out-migration to in-migration, and even some small rural counties along the southern border with Kansas. So kind of throughout the state, we had some improvements, but obviously you'll notice that the predominant color is the light gray, and those are counties that had out-migration both this decade and last decade. So that just continues the pattern. A lot of out-migration, especially as people graduate high school, head off to college, and then don't always come back to their hometown where they grew up. So that's one of Nebraska's interesting patterns. Again, I'll just note, I always have kind of some of these takeaways, again, some highlights. And I think the main takeaway on this one is that we did have so many more counties that switched from out-migration to in-migration. Again, 13 of those in the white shade, only 4 that did the opposite, where they had in-migration and switched to out-migration. So we definitely did better. And we saw that as far as the numbers of counties being relatively high that had in-migration. Okay, regarding the big three counties, this is the way we like to organize our population and try to understand our metro area versus our non-metro areas. So this is just a graph starting in 1950 for what portion of the population were in these two sets of major groups of counties, the big three or the other 90 of the Nebraska's counties. Okay, so you can see back in 1950, the big three had about a third of the state's population. The rural 90 counties had 2/3. That's trended downward. The two are opposites, of course. So it went across the 50% mark for being in the big three counties in the 2010 census, and now we're at 56% here in 2020. So just as a FYI, our office does population projections, and that's exactly where we pegged it, was 56%. So kind of a kudos for us that it came out exactly as we expected. And I've been giving these presentations for several years, highlighting this number. So people should have kind of expected that that's about where it would come out. The ramification from this is that when you take 56% times our 49 unicameral seats, that comes up to 27.4 seats that would be due, so to speak, to the big three counties. Okay, and that is an increase from 25.8 back in 2010. So we do expect the big three counties to have at least one more representative, probably one. And I'm not drawing the maps. They'll talk about some of that in the redistricting session at 10:30. But what I would do if I was looking at it would be to combine two districts in southern Lancaster County. That's where a lot of the fast growth is. That could pretty much equal one full district. And then there might have to be some movements from rural Nebraska to urban, these urban counties as well. So that'll be happening in special session here in the days and weeks ahead. Okay, so here are the highlights for those unicameral districts. Of our 49, 38 did achieve population growth. So that's a very high percentage. And a lot of those districts are in the big three counties. And when we look at the fastest growing districts that all hit that 10% mark or more, those were all in the big three counties. Okay, so that's just where our growth is centered. 10 of those 12 fastest growing have a district size that's 5% above the average size for the state. Why I highlight that is that those will basically be required to have their territory shift as a part of redistricting, because the guideline is that the district should not differ by more than 5% above to 5% below the overall average size. Okay, and you can see that the fastest growing district, number 39 in Elkhorn, was almost 50% above average. So to put this in raw numbers, that district has about 60,000 people now in the count. 40,000 is average. So it's 20,000 above, or again, almost 50% above. Okay, on the other side, we saw that of the 11 with loss, 8 of those were in what I'd call rural areas. These districts span pretty large territories, but generally rural. The other 3 were in micropolitan areas. So like they did have a city of 10,000, like North Platte or Scotts Bluff, but that was where the loss occurred. Notice that 16 districts are greater than 5% below the average size. So again, needing to change in shape by pretty much required to. 2 of those are in Douglas County. So again, it's not universal for how the population change occurs, but the pattern is that they tend to be more rural. And the least populated district, number 47 in the Panhandle, was 15% below the average size. So there is some changes that will occur as we move forward. Just note again that we do have all of the actual tables up on our website, putting on our 2020 page, which is simply our typical website of cpar.unomaha.edu, and then the /2020 census will take you to a 2020 census page. So you can check that out. Congressional districts, another place that has to be redistricted as part of the reasons why the census is done. So we have our 3 districts, okay, and we know with the state count over 1.9 million, we have an average district size about 650,000. The Lincoln-based district is about 6,000 above that. Omaha-based district, 47,000 above that average. So then the rural third-based district is about 53,000 below that average. So as I plop the actual numbers up on the screen, so here are the actual counts, we see that they started the decade with the same population after redistricting in 2011. But now, given the growth, we see that the Omaha-based district is 100,000 people higher than the third district based in rural Nebraska. Okay, so that's a pretty big differential. You can see the growth rates differing. Third district overall actually lost population. Solid growth in the first district, which has both Lincoln and quite a few rural counties. But this is very typical, exactly about what we saw in the 2000s. So here's the same table for the set of numbers back for the 2000s. The district boundaries were a little bit different at that time, most notably that District 2's Sarpy County portion in the 2000s was more in the Bellevue area, whereas here in the 2010s, it's more in Papillion and Gretna on the western side of the county, where a little bit more of the housing development is taking place, a little bit faster growth in District 2 compared to last decade. For rural, actually a smaller loss than what we saw in the 2000s. So a lot of rural Nebraska, while still losing, is losing less. So that's a positive sign for what we see for the state. Okay, cities and towns. Here's what we can see there. We did have 183 of our nearly 530 communities increase in population. That's up a little bit from 142 back in the 2000s. So you can see about a quarter grew in the 2000s. Now we're at 35%. We do still have a high number losing 10% or more of their populations. More than 160 communities did have that relatively high level of population loss, but that is down or doing better than what we saw in the 2000s, when more than 200 cities and towns lost more than 10% of their population. So that is some improvement there, but still a lot of work to do in rural development. One way we can look at the population is on our median size. And this is just kind of a fun factoid for when you're at a dinner party or some kind of event. You can let people know that the middle size town, right in the middle, has less than 300 people now. So where it would come out is Prague and Saunders County is 291 people. That's the exact middle. So half of Nebraska's incorporated places have fewer than 291 people. So it's just kind of an amazing stat. When you look at it, now 99 towns have fewer than 100 people. So it's kind of easy to remember. 99 places have 99 or fewer residents. So it is just kind of a factoid that you can use to understand Nebraska. And to note, when you have to incorporate, you do need more than 100 people. So at some point in time, all of these places did have more than 100, but now they're below that mark. There's a story up on our website in our news section about Monowee, Nebraska, which for a couple decades has had only one resident. So that person is the mayor and the city librarian and everything. So it's kind of interesting and fun human interest story if you want to check that out. The median has declined, again, as a lot of small places have lost population. Okay, so here is a look at all of our populations for cities. First of all, just doing a ranking from largest to smallest, starting with Omaha here and then going down just for those that had 10,000 or more. So again, you can look and find where you're at in the ranking. It's pretty much the same exact ranking as what we saw in 2010, except North Platte was number 8 at that time. And then Papillion was behind Columbus. So Columbus and Papillion switched places and North Platte fell back a little bit. So you can check out how those rank. But perhaps more interesting is a look at fastest growing places. So I'm ranking this by the growth rate here in the 2010s. And here we see those bedroom communities, Valley in Western Douglas County, Hickman in Southern Lancaster, same with Bennett, Bennington, Waverly, and then again, kind of suburban areas of Bellevue and Papillion, all growing more than 25%. Note on Hallam here, this is kind of a rebound from the tornado that they had in 2005. So their 2010 count was low because of some of those destroyed housing units. But as they've rebuilt, that has led pretty much back to where they were prior to the tornado. And you can look through here and see there's not too many places in rural areas, but there are a few. They tend to be smaller, but still hitting a high growth rate. So that's good to see. Tell you a few other notables that didn't make, again, about 15 places fit well on the slide. Gretna was our fastest growing location back in the 2000s. It currently ranked about number 20th, 21 exactly, for a growth rate, very solid around 15%, but below where it was in the 2000s. Lincoln is a major city. You can see how it compares, especially to Omaha, 18% growth in Omaha versus 13 in Lincoln. And then I point out for both Blair and Sydney, Blair had Dana College close early in the decade, so that hurt their overall population. There were estimated to be about 360 people in the dorms. They're no longer there, so that was a loss. And then, of course, with Sydney and the change with Cabela's being bought out and changing corporate headquarters, that led to a 5% loss in Sydney, which actually was below, or it was better than what some of our estimates suggested. So Sydney's count came out pretty well. And I think given all that's happened there, I think they can be not necessarily pleased, but it was a pretty good performance overall, given all the changes that have happened in Sydney the last couple of years. Okay, 2 slides to kind of summarize these city population changes. We do see a general shift as we go from smaller places to larger places. So it's very small towns, less than 100, going up to places with 1,000, and then places with 10,000. And you can generally see an upward sloping differential here to where we have population loss in places with less than 1,000 people. When you combine it all together, places with more than 1,000 were able to achieve growth. We do see, again, as it related to both not only Sydney and Blair, but a couple of others like Chadron in this 5,000 to 10,000 person category. Otherwise, so that held it back a little bit. Otherwise, you kind of stair step up with each larger city size, the population growth rates were higher. So a lot of times I do a slide like this with counties, but the counts for cities are out. So wanted to look at it for cities when we have these good numbers. So that's a trend there. Another one doing the same thing, looking at the sizes of places given their population, a look at, well, what portion of communities in that size category were able to achieve population growth. So starting here with the less than 100, a quarter of those places had population growth in the 2000s, about the same, 23% had growth here in the 2010s. But when you go across the categories, what you'll notice is that almost all of them had an improvement. More counties grew this decade than last decade. I'll highlight this one here for those places with 2,500 to 5,000 residents. This would be places like Valentine or David City in Nebraska. And only about a third of those places had population growth in the 2000s. Now that's up over 70% this decade. So that is a really large improvement there. It's just notable when I look at the numbers. So again, almost all the categories improved. So Nebraskans, we are doing better. Up at the very top, the very largest places, almost all had population growth in the 2000s. This decade, we did see North Platte and Scotts Bluff and one other not quite make the growth rate. I think it was Beatrice, didn't get growth this decade, so it popped down just a little bit. Okay, so that is kind of phase 1 of the presentation. And now I'll move into phase 2 with these race and ethnicity trends. All right, so when we want to take a peek at Nebraska's population, there are 2 major groups, that we can start with to look at and then get more specific. But generally, we've had slow growth and outmigration for whites, while in-migration and sizable population growth for persons of color. Okay, so here's some of those numbers. First of all, looking for whites over the last several decades, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and today. So in the 80s, we did see a small population loss among our white population, 1%. That's about what we had here in the 2000s as well. Both timeframes lost about 15,000 people, is what the census has told us. And for the data we have available, where we can look at births and deaths versus migration, we do see more births than deaths among our white population. But you can see that it was about 55,000 the last 2 decades, dropped down to less than 40,000 here in the 2010s. And given outmigration, we just didn't quite have the level of births exceeding deaths to fully counteract that. So it did lead to some overall population loss among whites. I kind of expected us to have a small growth, but I'm not necessarily surprised either to see some population losses, again, as our older population having more deaths as we move forward. Okay, but we have seen outmigration these last several decades, just the way Nebraska historically has seen outmigration when our population was more white than what it is today. Okay, so that outmigration has kind of continued among our white population. For persons of color, we do see, so it's the same table. Net migration over here is red, hot, going upward. So we had almost 90,000 more people move in than move away who were persons of color this past decade. We also see births succeeding deaths, that is rising over time as well. So both population factors are positive, leading to about 150,000 numeric growth among persons of color. And you can see how that's trended upward over time. The growth rate has come down again as the population base expands. It's harder to have a higher and higher growth rate, but again, very, very respectable, very fast growth here among our persons and population of color. So in the 80s, the growth rate was not very high. Then the in-migration wave hit in the 90s, and we saw very fast growth in the 1990s among our persons of color. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about a little bit, is the history of this and how it's all came together. So in 1990, when we take a look at the graph of what portion of each age group, so they're going up on the left-hand side, what portion of the age group was a person of color? Okay, so about 10% of our children under 10 were either non-white or Hispanic Latino at 1990 at that point in time. So that's kind of a key number. And I'm going to go through this slide fairly fast because they'll stay up on the screen as we go to 2000 and then here to 2020. So as we hit 2000 and immigration wave starts, people come to Nebraska for work purposes. We saw these percentages that were persons of color at younger ages, young adults, I should say, went ahead and doubled, from 9% up to 18% here for people in their early 20s, almost doubled from 10% up towards 20%. So we saw this bump in young workers at that point in time. And that's the stage of life where people also have young children. So we see the percent of those who are either non-white or Hispanic Latino growing and doubling again from 10% up to 20% by 2000. Okay, so that's how the changes happened initially. Now we're here with the new 2020 numbers. Don't have it for all the ages yet, so these are just population estimates shown in red. But again, you can see the growth to where now more than a third of young children under 10 are persons of color, and then it scales back. Don't quite see the bump in this young adult age the way we did so much in the 2000s. It's kind of filled in, but even though it scales back to lower levels of diversity at older ages, all age groups have diversified over these 30 years. So diversity is a pattern that we expect to continue. It's definitely having a lot of impacts throughout the state. I'll note that while more in the population estimates, more than 22% were persons of color, the new census value that we have on that particular number is 24.3%. So when we do get the data for all of the specific age groups, I would expect them to be slightly further to the right, showing more diversity across ages. But again, you can see the pattern and how it's changed, and we look forward to receiving that data either later this year or early next year. Just to show you a look at how the population structure differs. So the last slides I went over were what portion of the state's population were persons of color. This is a look at what is the structure of the population for persons of color by themselves. Okay, so among all persons of color, what is their age and sex structure? So we have, again, younger ages going up to older ages. You can obviously see that this has a pyramid shape. So we have a lot of people at the youngest age categories, very few at the oldest age categories. So this is exactly the way Nebraska looked 100 years ago when our population was predominantly white European immigrants to the United States that might have came in 1900 or 1910. So it had a lot of children, few elders. So that's a situation where you're going to have a lot of births and not very many deaths. Okay? Contrast that with the shape of our white population, where we do see baby boomers in the dark red being our predominant population segment yet, very high also among our millennial population. But then we have this shrinking base of children. Okay, so that was very different than among our persons of color. So I'll flip it back one more time. Again, the pyramid shape of that population structure, as opposed to this, it's got pretty much kind of a flat lines across here. There's no real shape to this per se, but we do see each of these bars for younger ages contracting inward just a little bit. And we do have numbers from Health and Human Services to show that our level of births among non-Hispanic whites have been coming down each of these past 5 years. So that suggests that these census estimates are in line with what we're seeing from what I'd call hard records of all the birth certificates that are filed. So this pattern is playing out in reality. When we look at persons of color having increase and diversity rising from that perspective, at the same time, we're also seeing some population declines among whites. So when we break it down for our counties, what we see here is that very few locations shown in red are having both growth among persons of color and the white population. So this decade, we only had 8 counties where the white population grew. Okay, you can see again, centered in urban eastern Nebraska and in the Kearney and Grand Island area. All other counties shown in gray had the white population decline while simultaneously having the population of color rise. Okay, now this isn't a new pattern. It's the same. I've shown this map for the 2000s many times, and in that decade we had 3/4 of Nebraska counties be in the gray shade, where again white population loss at the same time population of color was rising. So this has just been the pattern, and we see these impacting the numbers, and it's just the pattern that we see. So as you look at community development, that is something to just be aware of. Talk a little bit about population growth. Again, we had 24 counties that increased, remember from some of our very early slides, but 16 of those increased again because gains among people of color exceeded decline among whites. So here's the table of all those locations, including the state overall, where again, the white population declined, persons of color increased. So 100% of the state's growth can be attributed to populations of color. So we can see here some very diverse locations where the white population went down, population of color increased. And in the 2000s decade, there were 11 such counties. So it was 16 this decade, 11 last decade. A lot of these same ones in the list would be on that table for the 2000s if I was showing it. But what's unique about this decade is when we look at all the places, even Sarpy County, suburban Saunders County, as you have people commuting in from Wahoo, even those locations had more than 50% of their population growth attributable to populations of color. Okay, so Sarpy County, for example, in the 2000s was about 1/4 of its growth was attributable to population of color. Now in this decade was over half. So all of the counties with population growth had at least half of their gains be attributable to populations of color. Okay, so just to understand how important the rises in our diverse communities have been to our overall population growth. Okay, so I want to detail some of the race-specific numbers now. I've been talking about persons of color in general. Here are some of our specific categories. I'm going to start you out with understanding the 2000s, and then I'll build here to the 2010s. So our Hispanic Latino growth was very high in the 2000s, about 73,000 people, or 77%. And that's what got a lot of the attention in the 2000s. But when you can look across some of the other racial groups, all had population growth, very small for whites, but very respectable for many of these other non-white population groups. The persons that listed 2 or more races, so they were NA, non-Hispanic here, just to try to make everything fit on the slide, non-Hispanic, but had 2 or more races, also had very high growth in the 2000s. not as high as Latino, but up there at the top. Okay, and that's what we're going to see here in the 2010s, is a very large rise among this 2 or more race category. I'll note here, just as an aside, that we did eke out population gain among whites, and that was different than some of our best comparison states of Iowa and Kansas, and a total of 15 states overall lost white population in the 2000s. Okay, so what I'm going to show you on the next slide is the same graph, same table, but adding in the 2000 data. Okay, so it looks like there's a lot of information here, but basically I'm just adding in the 2020 number so that we can see those, as well as the 2020 growth rates in red. Okay, so here's that 60% growth among that multiracial category. This decade, 155% growth. So again, if you look at raw number, last decade, this category grew by about 11,000. Here it's 44,000. So again, 4 times higher, whether you're looking at the numeric number or the growth rate. All right. We also see extremely high growth among the other race category, 200%, but it remains a fairly small category, only 6,000, as opposed to those who are non-Hispanic, but 2 or more races being listed, now it's 73,000. So that is starting to rival our Black population for just raw number. Again, we do see strong growth among our Latino population, but kind of as our population projections by race suggested, that while we grow about the same number this decade, the growth rate would be cut in half. All right, so in some of our projections, we were about 36% growth for Latino. It ended up being 40%. So that is no longer the fastest growing particular race group. We even see Asian having a 60% growth rate, only 20,000 people as opposed to 67,000 for Latino. But we see some differences now in who's growing the fastest. The white population did lose over this decade. I'll note that there were 35 states overall who lost white population, and Nebraska's loss was among the smallest. Okay, so we lost 1%. That was about the smallest there was. And the losses in Iowa and Kansas were higher than in Nebraska, so we outperformed some of our best comparison states. Finally, I want to break down those multi-race individuals so we can see and understand some of those patterns, because that's what stands out, that 155% growth, or again, more than 44,000 people. So these are all different categories of people who listed 2 or more races, as well as being non-Hispanic. So we have white and Black, white and American Indian, white and Asian, some others. The only one where it was not a white combination, but Black and American Indian, that had more than 1,000. So that's why I'm listing only those with more than 1,000 people here. And then all of the other combinations that there could be, a lot of small categories, only a couple hundred of, say, American Indian and Asian, for example. So I'm lumping all those together. But here's how the numbers came out. Focus on the change, okay? So for this category of white with another race, it went from basically 0, not very many, 450, to now being almost 14,000, okay? So that is a huge shift. We're going to get more information from the Census Bureau about this as they do their research on the results. It might be something to do with how the questions were asked, some intricacies in how things were listed, some examples that were given. So again, given these numbers just came out 2 weeks ago, don't have all of the details and understanding yet, but we will try to express that to you as best we can. But that's one that I want to focus on. Additionally, you see very high growth among those who listed that they were white and American Indian. So Native American, again, 14,000, kind of rivaling that here. And then a doubling of those who listed they were white and Asian at the same time. So this could be among children. I think that's predominantly where a lot of this growth is, but we'll see as we dig into the numbers even more. What I want to note for this 44,000 growth in people who are listing 2 or more races, the vast majority of that is white with some other race. So in what we see happening, we see the white alone population going down. That was the loss of 1% shown on the prior slides. But our white, what we'd call in combination, in combination with another race, that actually went up quite dramatically. So I think that our office and others might have to adjust a little bit on how we try to understand racial and ethnic changes, because typically we wanted to look at races alone, so that everything added up to 100% and made a nice total. Everything summed up exactly. When we start adding in combination, things for a particular race go higher than the total population because some people are getting counted twice or in each group. But I think that might be the way we have to go, or start making some adjustments, just given this huge growth that we've seen this decade. Again, 4 times higher than we saw in this category in the 2000s. So that's a big shift. Okay, Census does have a visualization tool where you can look at some of those numbers. Here, I'm just going to show you the Asian non-Hispanic example. So they have a map, okay, and you can look at their color codes, and you can see Nebraska's in the purple, the highest shade. They also have a state ranking. So you can look and find Nebraska in the ranking, and we were 6th highest in the growth among all states for non-Hispanic Asian category. Okay, so you can see that. They also have the county maps, so you can go in through there and see a lot of this growth is in Douglas County, of course. Many of these more rural counties, when you're on the site listed right here, and you hover your cursor there, it will show you what that level was. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go show you an example there, although we could if the people want to see it. That's usually only a handful of people in a lot of these locations. So it's going to be driven again by your more populated areas, Lincoln, Sarpy County, Grand Island, Kearney, etc. But it's a very interesting and useful interactive to be able to see those numbers come across your screen. Okay, final section for this morning is taking a look at children and changes in household size. So when we want to take a look at the overall population growth among children, I'm going to start with 2000. And since 2000, because at that time, the millennial population born in the 80s and early 90s were under 18. Okay, so I'm going to show you the differences between when millennials were below 18 and today. So 2000 to 2020. So here's the county map. Start with the red, which is an increase in the under 18 population. So we see here again, the Tri-Cities area, urban areas, and then a few places with a lot of diversity, Colfax with Schuyler, and then Dakota County in the South Sioux area, the Sioux City Metro. Those are places having increases in kids. So again, even though the state has grown by about 8% in children, only 12 counties have increased in children over that time. Anything in gray and even the white shade this time is a loss of population in this age range. So if you look throughout here, this again, entire southern border with Kansas is predominantly in gray, almost all of the Sand Hills area in gray, as well as the Panhandle, even being white here again is showing population loss among children. So when you look at our medium-sized communities, Scottsbluff, North Platte, Lexington, Hastings and Adams County, and Norfolk and Columbus, all of those areas at least have a small amount of, a lesser amount of children today than what they did back in 2000. Okay, so even in some of our areas of population growth, children are not necessarily growing in those locations. So it is something that's changing. It does beg the question, a lot of this rural area, if more school consolidations might happen at some point. But there's a lot of more people that study that issue than myself. So I just want to get the population numbers out there, the new ones, so people can understand these changes. Again, comparing back to 2000, when that millennial population was under 18, breaking it down by race. So want to look at non-Hispanic whites here. There's only a couple of counties that have achieved population growth among whites. So they tend to be the urban areas, Sarpy and Lancaster County, as well as one really small county out west. Again, that's literally a handful of people, maybe 15 or 20 growth in the number of children since 2000 there. But even Douglas County has 10% fewer white children today than what they did in 2000. So that's kind of interesting to statistic, given all the housing growth and things that we've seen across Douglas County to still seeing the level of white children decline. The bottom 15 counties here shown, kind of below the gap. So we have top 15 counties above, and then the bottom 15 counties below. Again, if you look through here, very rural locations, along with a couple of diverse locations, Colfax County and Dakota County. Again, we see some significant changes there. Overall, if we want to kind of summarize these changes, our non-Hispanic white children have declined by about 53,000 or 14% since 2000. At the same time, persons of color under 18 have risen by 88,000. So that's why we have the growth, more than a doubling of the child population of color statewide over that time. Just a couple of more slides to show you what can be done with some of the numbers now. Here's a look at neighborhood level geographies for Douglas County. It's what we call census tracts. So they tend to have about 4,000 people on average, up to about 8,000. So we kind of have some road labels here to give you a perspective. 72nd Street goes across the entire Douglas County here as a boundary line. Also, I saw some differences between west of 180th and east of 180th. So I wanted to point that out. So again, high growth in red, 10% or more growth in children. We of course see that along the periphery of the city of Omaha where the new housing construction is going in, but also several other locations in kind of central Omaha on the northern side and some in South Omaha as well. So the growth was kind of distributed throughout the county. The gray bars are showing places that did lose children. So white is small growth, but let's focus on the gray. And you can see some of the less population of children around Boys Town area, also around Millard, some parts of Midtown, and then kind of around the Benson area. We see this dark gray shade. So when you look at this entire area, kind of between 680 and 180th Street, around Millard and up towards Maple Street, et cetera, there's no red in through here. So it's either low growth in children or an actual decline. So there could be some pressures on school enrollments and things like that in districts that are located and schools that are located here. So just you can start to see and understand these patterns. I will note again that overall the county's population of children did increase by more than 10%, which would be like this red shade overall, even though it was not evenly distributed. I think that's a takeaway from this one. Finally, we looked at Douglas County on the last slide. Here's some information for Lancaster County, taking a look at average household size, and that has been going down for a long period of time. Again, the graph starts in 1970, but in the 2010s, we did see that number tick up ever so slightly, both statewide in red and in Douglas County. So perhaps this long-term downtrend of smaller household sizes is either going to even out here or not continue its long-term downtrend. So anytime we see a change in trend like that, we like to bring it to people's attention. Okay, so wrapping up, just what's coming from the Census Bureau. We do have American Community Survey data to be released soon. There is some quality concern about fewer completed interviews given what happened with some of the COVID protocols. So they're going to delay the release of one-year HCS data, and it's going to be in limited form. So this is all your income and poverty and educational attainment, some of the socioeconomic characteristics. So we do expect that, but later on in the year, the 5-year data, if you're used to using that, should not be as impacted. So it's expected to come out in its usual form in early December. From the 2020 census, the next thing we expect to get is kind of a profile of commonly used statistics, such as the age groups, like those 5-year age groups, as well as items like home ownership, family type between like married couples versus single parents and things like that. So that's a very handy profile to have. Haven't seen a date yet, but I expect it by the end of the year. And finally, then we'll start moving beyond the 2020 census numbers already into the new population estimates for 2021. Those always come out by the end of the calendar year. So it'll help us understand what's changed in the pandemic, births, deaths, and especially migration. So that's where we stop. And I'll turn it over to Josie and see what kind of questions have come through and continue to put those in the Q&A feature.
Thanks so much, David. So much great information. And just a reminder, we will make all of this available here in the coming days. So you will have access to this depth of information. But we did get some great questions. We will get to as many as we can. But I would say keep them coming in. I know David would follow up with you after if we don't get to them live. Slam dunk to start us off. Does UNOCPAR produce population projections? If so, how did our projections compare to actual census counts? And I think it's fair to mention too that estimates program that we use when we don't have this great rich census data.
Yeah, so the total state count of 1.96 million came in about 20,000 higher than both our projections and the Census Bureau's official estimates. And that's happened the last 2 decades as well, both in the 1990s estimates versus the 2000 count, and then the 2000s estimates versus the 2010 count. So it's not without precedent. I think it goes to show that we had a good count, number one, in that, again, we did achieve a higher self-response rate than 10 years ago. And we're also continue to see that high population growth among persons of color. And that's a very hard group for the Census Bureau to estimate, especially people coming in from international locations. So I think overall, our projections and estimates were on the right track. Again, especially the Douglas, Sarpy, and Lancaster County being at 56%. But there are some locations where either the count is a little bit higher or lower than those estimates.
Wonderful. Going back to earlier in the presentation, you mentioned natural change as a major component of population growth here in Nebraska. Is that true in other states? What are major components in other states? How do we compare there?
Well, Nebraska is known for 2 things. I always like to say we work really hard, so we have very high labor force participation rates, and then we have a lot of children. Our family sizes are relatively large, our fertility rates relatively high. So across pretty much any characteristic, we're a top 5 fertility rate state, and that leads our natural change to being relatively higher than most other states. Other states that have more in-migration, like Texas, Florida, the Carolinas, more of their population growth is from that migration component. Whereas in Nebraska, as you've seen until recently, we've tended to have the out-migration overall. So the migration portion is definitely smaller in Nebraska, and most of our growth is coming from that natural change. I'll note also that across the country, research out of New Hampshire and other locations show that more than half of the states are having more deaths than births among whites. Wow. That is not happening here in Nebraska. We have more births than deaths among whites, but it has been coming down. It used to be in the 4,000 to 5,000 a year range. The most recent data for 2019 was only about 1,200, 1,500 higher, more births than deaths. So it has trended downward, and that we don't know what all the pandemic changes are going to be, but there will be some pressure on that going forward.
Staying on the topic of components of population change, someone asked about the large outmigration during the 1980s. Was that the farm crisis? Why that uptick during that time?
Yeah, that was 2 things. Early in that decade, there was a recession, a pretty strong recession. That's when Nebraska's unemployment rates hit all-time highs, even in the Great Recession. And here in the pandemic, unemployment did not spike as high as what it did in the early 1980s. So that led some people to look for work elsewhere early in the decade. And then mid-decade, 85 to 87 was really the height of the farm crisis. And that is the last point in time where Nebraska actually had years of population loss. So we have to go back over 30 years to find a time frame where we had actual population loss. And that happened in the mid-80s decade for when that farm crisis was at its highest.
Great, thank you. So topic that comes up here, we have heard in the news rural population loss, urban population gain, but you mentioned bedroom communities and actually a growth in suburbanization. And so someone asked, is Omaha's growth due to annexation, those kind of suburban areas? And then just mention too that some of that loss of population has been in core urban areas. So that sort of dynamic of suburbanization.
Yeah, so all of that is true. A lot of Omaha's growth was due to annexing additional territory. So again, when we compare the 2010 count, it was for the geography at that time. The new 2020 count has additional territory in the city. So that is one of the reasons why Omaha achieved the level of growth it did. Perhaps one of the main reasons why it grew faster than the city of Lincoln, because Lincoln is not quite as aggressive in its annexation policies. So that is definitely a factor. We do see a lot of growth, especially downtown. So in some of the places being revitalized, things are changing, but there are pockets of the city that are having population loss. So we saw it in the graph of, map of children. Also have that same map for total population. So very soon we'll start to put things like that up onto our website, those value-added products, so we can start to see and understand those changes. Suburban wise, I think just a lot of individuals and families find those smaller places that are kind of in between Lincoln and Omaha, your Waverlys, Ashland, and then perhaps between Lincoln and Beatrice, your Hickmans and Firths, where people might have one spouse working in one location, one in another, and then their commute times are both a little bit reduced by locating in the middle. So I would think that those will continue to be attractive places to reside in the years ahead.
I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll give everybody a break. I think David will answer any open questions. Maybe you can type in the answer during the break to those, sure. Or we will reach out by email to those that we didn't get to. So much great information and things to cover, but then we will take a break and we will be right back at this same link. You can leave and come back or just stay in at 10:30. So Dave, has all the 2020 census data, race, ethnicity, age, etc., been released and is it ready to use?
Well, those particular pieces, at least certain parts of them have been released. So on the race data, we have it for the total population, as well as adults over 18, and we can subtract out to see children under 18. But later on, either by the end of the year or early next year, we'll get more detailed information by race as well, such as by 5-year age groups or specific ages. So we can see like the high school age population or junior high or things like that. There'll be more detail coming. So not everything is out yet. And in this redistricting data set that just came out 2 weeks ago, it's really only about 5 variables that we can identify. So it's like households and group orders and average household size, race, there's home vacancy versus occupancy. So some of the urban planners might be interested in some of those numbers, but then just total population as well. So that's all we have right now. Much more detail to come from what's a very rich data source.
Absolutely. And we do have some really interesting questions about those race ethnicity questions that were asked on the 2020 census. This is why we need a break. So we will get to those. We will answer those. Some really interesting things going on there, and we will be right back at 10:30. Dave, thank you so much for everything you have done to put that together in a rapid speed to be able to do all that. We really appreciate it. See you all in just a few minutes.
Thanks so much.
Back, everyone. Hi, we are so excited to be here. Really important topic up next. Dave presented on the trends for the 2020 census that are influencing Nebraska, and those very consequential trends will be applied in the redistricting effort that is already underway here in Nebraska. So we've brought in 2 great panelists to talk a little bit about that process in other states as well as here in Nebraska. And then we will have a robust conversation, I'm sure, about what that all means. You both get ready for some questions, I imagine. Couple reminders before we turn it over to our first presenter. After each speaker, we'll have time for a few questions. Before we have that panel conversation, use that Q&A feature. I will be the moderator again, and it is really helpful to see those questions early and often to help make sure we answer them. The chat feature is enabled if you want to tell us something technical, but use Q&A for substantive questions. Materials and the recordings will be posted. I will put that in the chat again. I'm also going to put on pretty early here the link to the evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback about today's event, other events in the series, and things CPAR can be doing to help you all as data users. So I am ready to introduce someone I'm so excited was able to be with us today, Wendy Underhill. Wendy is the director of the Elections and Redistricting Program for the National Conference of State Legislatures. Wendy is the resource for all things redistricting, and her unparalleled knowledge on this process, national, state, and local level, will be of great importance to us. Thank you so much for being here, Wendy.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, that's great. So I am going to turn it over to you. You should be able to share your screen and share a little bit with this group.
Did that work? Are you seeing my screen?
Works just perfectly. We hear you, we see you, we see the screen. So you should be good to go. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Josie. For those of you who don't know, I had a little time mix up. So Josie was really glad that I was here just now because she was pretty worried that I was not going to make it. So, and I'm glad to be here too. I had a little fun yesterday thinking about what your organization might do, and I invented all kinds of things. And so then afterwards I looked up some of the other things that you've done over the course of this year or plan for going ahead. And I began to get a little bit of a sense of it. So I will put a little more emphasis on the role that data uses in redistricting than I might with some other groups. So that's going to be fun for me. And I came up with a new frame yesterday, which I think I'm going to use with you all as my beta test on this. And then we'll see if I use it elsewhere. And that's to say that redistricting takes three things. It's a three-legged stool. And one leg of that is people. You can't do it without that. One is law. There's lots and lots and lots of law on this, not all of which I am familiar with. So you can ask me questions and we'll see how deep I can go, not very. And the third is data. You got to have good data to be able to do good redistricting. So data, law, and people, they all interact. Let's see if I can get my slide to advance. Let's go over here. All right, so I'm going to skip that because I don't want to have you looking at that picture. Okay, so the National Conference of State Legislatures, that's where I work. As you might guess from our title, we support the work of legislators and legislative staff throughout the nation. We are a bipartisan organization in terms of our structure about who's our president and vice president and such. And the work that we do is all nonpartisan. We try to be objective. We are kind of known for just the facts, that kind of a thing. And we take questions from legislators and legislative staff, and we handle them in a confidential manner. We do, though, provide lots of information that anybody is welcome to. And I personally am happy to take questions from anybody. And since I rely on people like Wayne in the States, he'll be your next presenter, I always like to be able to support election officials as well as the legislators. So I think that the world gets better when we all collaborate together. So now I'm going to move on to what are the most important things about redistricting. And I'm going to start with that states are in charge of it. There's so much in our nation that has sort of over the course of decades devolved to the federal level, but that is not true with redistricting. This is very much a state responsibility. Now, you may be thinking back now, what was that thing that just happened in April on something about Congress? Well, that was reapportionment. And that is based on a formula that does come out of the Census Bureau and goes through the president and on to the Congress. And it determines how many seats each state will have in the US House. So that's either called apportionment or reapportionment. It's one of those weird words like flammable and inflammable. They mean the same thing. Apportionment and reapportionment mean the same thing. I don't know why, but that is a separate thing from what we're talking about today. We're talking about redistricting. So what is redistricting? Let's see. It is done for the very purpose of making sure that each person in the United States has equal access to their representative at the state level or congressional level. So it's about making sure that each of those districts, those geographically bounded districts, have the same number of people in them. And we take that for granted, but I want you to know that in the first half of the 20th century, states kind of didn't bother redistrict. And if you don't bother redistrict and the population moves around, you can get to the point where a legislator in an urban district, let's say Los Angeles, could have 10 or 20 or even higher times the number of people in their district as someone out in a rural area. And is that equal? Well, in the 1960s, the Supreme Court took a series of cases that basically said, no, it is not. And the phrase one person, one vote came up, and Chief Justice Warren was head of the court at that point. And he said, legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests. It was the first time that our nation was clear that representation is based on people, not land. And just to be clear, in the past, a lot of states had it sort of set up like the US Senate is, where every county got one or two representatives, and then the others were divided up by population. And you can see that that's an advantage for the smaller counties. So it started with trying to figure out how to have the same number of people in each district. Well, you can't make the people move from one place to another to make them equal. So you have to move the boundaries of the districts. And that's what redistricting is all about. I think I've probably said everything we need to know about that topic. Oh, wait, let me just add that if you're going to be talking about people moving, you're talking about data. You need to know where those people are and where they're moving from and to. So just sharing that data comes right at the very core. And they've always used census data for this. There was one decade when they didn't bother to do this, but at the congressional level with that reapportionment. But basically, you got to have that data comes from the census to be able to do the redistricting. Next slide, Wendy. Okay, so what I think of as the second most important principle relates to race. And this is a complicated legal conundrum. There's the Equal Protection Clause that would indicate that you can't take race into account. And then there's the Voting Rights Act that is very explicit that laws cannot be made that are retrogressive for minority populations, that can't make the access to the political world less good than it currently is for racial minorities. And in fact, you know, the VRA had lots of other things in it to make sure that people could register to vote and that candidates could be nominated and have a chance to run and have a chance to be elected. So we have these two things. One is be race neutral out of the Equal Protection Clause, and the other is make sure that you have accommodated racial minorities. And in the 1960s, that referenced African Americans. Now that also includes Latinos or Hispanics, and it certainly can include Asians or other groups as they get larger, and we might see some of that this decade. Okay, so how do you thread this needle? How do you find that balance between too much or too little, the Goldilocks thing? Well, it's by using data, and there's racially polarized voting block analysis. That's a mouthful. But it is 100% done by statisticians. People with PhDs after their names are the ones who do that. And they're the ones who provide that information to the people who are doing redistricting in advance so that they can know what the districts look like. It's not just how many people of one of those races or ethnicities are in a district. It's how do they vote? Do they have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice? Are they a group that is cohesive? So you got to prove those things before you can say, I made this district to be in alignment with the VRA. And if you just kind of shoot and say, well, I think 55% population African-American will be good enough, that's not good enough when you get into court. So you need the great data work prior to developing those majority minority districts and then ready to go to court with you as well. So moving on to the criteria, and each state has its own criteria that are usually identified in the state constitution. They can be in statute, but usually they're in the constitution. Makes it a little harder to change them willy-nilly, but certainly we've seen several states that have changed some of their criteria this year through the ballot box by taking things to the voters. So these rules are not static, and also not only can you have constitutional rules, you can have statutory rules, you can also have guidelines. So the legislative committee that does this work could easily set up some additional guidelines for themselves that would be true for this decade only, and then the state could adopt those again for the next year if they wanted to. So I've listed on this slide many of the things, and you all can guess that compactness is something that can be measured with numbers. There are several different formulas for determining how compact something is. Generally speaking, some judges go with the eyeball technique. You can get into some depths on what to do with that. Contiguity makes sense that you shouldn't have to leave a district to get back into the district, so there's no donut holes. I guess there are some exceptions. If you're in Hawaii and you have islands, you might have water in between parts of the district, but generally speaking, water is a pretty good barrier. And then preserving with data. You can count how many counties were split. That is a knowable fact. Now I want to tell you all that my computer is telling me my internet connection is unstable. If it gets so unstable that we have problems, we will find a new way. And Josie, you've got my slides if you need to stick them up there. And why don't you rattle off a phone number I could call if I get in that problem? Or it's on my invitation, isn't it?
We did lose you for a second. It is probably on your invitation. I think it's going to be all right. Let's just power through.
Okay, let's hope things hold. Okay, so the ones that are below the first three are harder to measure. A community of interest is a hot topic this year, and it references what people think is their own community. It doesn't mean what's their political boundary, not what's their county or their city boundary, but who do they think they have common interests with? These could be economic interests in particular, but they could be religious interests or anything else. There was a district in Los Angeles that related to the flyover zone from LAX. So it can be whatever the people decide it is. So now you've got people from all different walks of life drawing on napkins or on fancy software what they think their community of interest is. And that is hard then for the state to figure out how to put that all together and use that as a criterion. I'm going to skip over some of these others, but I do want to say Nebraska is one of just 5 states that prohibits the use of political data when it does redistricting. Other states scratch their heads and say, how could you possibly do it without knowing who voted how? And in fact, I don't think you could do majority minority districts without knowing how people voted. But so I just want you to know that the rest of the country looks at you and those other 4 states and scratches their heads. It means to me, I think that Nebraska has decided to do it with strict demography, but maybe Wayne can weigh in on that. And then competitiveness, if some states ask that they make their districts competitive, that also clearly takes data to know, and that would be impossible to do if you don't use political data because you don't know what would be competitive. So my point is, you've got those 2 great big federal laws that are principles: one person, one vote, don't discriminate, but find that middle ground between ignore race and use race. And then you've got all of these state specific things. And that's kind of the legal framework, but you can see already that law and data come together. So now I want to move over to the people side of things. And this map shows states that use commissions. Those are the ones that are in the orange or the turquoise, and states that the legislature is in charge. And I've only given you the slide that talks about drawing legislative lines. If we were going to talk about drawing congressional lines, it would be a different map. When you squish those 2 maps together, it just becomes a jumble of colors, and it's very pretty, like jelly beans, but it's not very useful. So I'm just focusing on one thing. And then what message I'd like you to get out of this is that generally speaking, around the nation, it is the legislature that does redistricting. That's more common. And those ones that are in orange, still the legislature's responsibility in the end, but they do have advisory committees, that some of which are stronger, some of which are less strong, to advise them on how they think the line should be drawn. But back to the legislature for an up or down vote, and off to the governor in almost all states, not necessarily North Carolina. So here's where you're going to find your people who are doing redistricting. It is in the legislature, and I think your Senate is easier to contact than many. I don't feel like there's barriers to citizen communication with legislatures in Nebraska is very high. You might have a different opinion, and we can look into that. Oh, I went one too far. Okay, now we've got the public role. So I mentioned the communities of interest, where individuals can decide what they think their group that should be kept whole is. Well, a lot of people have other ideas. The political parties might think that the district should be drawn in a way that benefits them. And some people might say, well, let's go ahead and have some strongly Democratic districts and some strongly Republican ones, and just keep 2 or 3 or 4 that are going to be competitive. Those are all decisions that people on the outside will likely want to say something about. And so how are they going to do that? They're going to be hearings. And I bet that there's a series of hearings to be held in Nebraska this year that will try to elicit that kind of public participation. And then there are things called Dave's redistricting and a few other systems by which just plain old people can use data that's provided to them and software that's provided to them online and draw their own districts. And some of this software is really quite sophisticated. That will know that if you're in Nebraska, not to use political data and otherwise to follow the law in Nebraska. It will know how many people are in each census block according to the most recent data release. And it will be able to tell you at the end whether this tends to lean a little on the Democratic side or a little on the Republican side, or there are various kinds of outputs if you want to ask for those. So now you've got people who are testifying in person by standing up in a meeting. You've got another set of people who are writing letters or sending in emails. And then you've got some people who are drawing either whole maps, whole districts and whole state maps, or drawing their own communities of interest. So there's this flood of information flowing into, in your case, the legislative staff. So how do they deal with it? This decade, we're starting to see some sophisticated ways to manage that amount of data input. And I think data scientists out there could probably come up with some ways that would code and be useful. But in terms of the maps, and particularly the communities of interest, if you got a whole lot in and they were able to be scanned somehow into a program, you could stack them one on top of another and then use like a heat map to look at it. And where it's darker would be where there was a lot of agreement that that was a community of interest. That's happening in just a couple of states. I don't think that it's going to be happening in more than maybe a couple, maybe as many as a half a dozen this year. But my point here is the public is part of the people who make redistricting work, and they do care how it turns out, and they will be louder this decade than they ever have been before, in part because the media has been paying greater attention to redistricting than they ever have before. So I'm going to talk about the courts too, and I kind of squeezed this under people because judges are people too. On the other hand, courts are kind of monolithic and they don't quite feel like people to me, but that's where they ended up here. And the courts are pretty much always busy with redistricting. The final Supreme Court decision of the 2011 cycle or the 2010 census cycle with 2011 redistricting was finished in 2018. I hope I'm right about that. There could still be some little things dragging on. And the last big state case was decided in 2019. So we're talking the entire decade long. And there's something that I don't understand, probably the lawyers on the call will, about why it is redistricting cases sort of jump a level and go straight to the Supreme Court. But every decade there's the Supreme Court rules, I don't know, 6-8 times on various different things. So this year, the expectation is this decade, the 2020s decade, the expectation is that it'll be more in federal courts, more in state courts than in federal court. That has to do with one of the rulings from last decade that you probably all heard. The sort of on the street view is that you can't sue about over partisanship in federal courts. Well, if you can't sue in federal courts because you think it's too partisan, where can you go? You can go to the state courts. But what's important for all of these cases now in the last 10 years, for sure, is that data is what drove decisions. Now we have had one, I think it was Chief Justice Roberts, said he didn't want to see any more of this political science gobbledygook. Gobbledygook was the key word there. But on the other hand, it is this kind of data that comes from expert witnesses that can show whether a district that was drawn appropriately took into account the requirements of the VRA or inappropriately did, or that show that the balance of population, we did one person, one vote. well, in the legislative realm, it can be sort of plus or minus 5. But if the plaintiff can say that within that 10-point difference that it was done for partisan gain, it's data that's going to show whether that's true or not. So I think all of the attorneys are making close friends with their political scientists and statisticians and demographers right now, because they're going to need them while they're drawing the maps, and then they're going to need them when they get to court. So I did mention that the census is sort of the beginning of the process, and it is obviously all about data. And I think you all had a session earlier this year on using the new format for the census. And I recognize that the census provides many different things besides data for redistricting. For instance, it is used to distribute, I know this number, $1.5 trillion in federal funds to states and localities every year. That 1.5 trillion was true from, is an average from 2011 through 2020. That is a whole lot of money. And it means that people in the states want to make sure that their account is as correct as it can be, because every extra person you can get counted brings about $2,500 more into the state every year for the decade. So money really matters a whole lot. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the data for the redistricting side of things. And this year, as you probably know, the data was delayed hugely. And it was delayed because of the pandemic, but it was also delayed because of some policy choices. I mean, the pandemic had the Census Bureau in a tumult, and then the Trump administration wanted to get the data out as soon as it could, so it pushed, and then they went to court. And between that wrangling, it just delayed them even further, as it turns out. And so not only was the counting slowed down, but the post-counting processing was slowed down. And so the data for redistricting came out on August 12th, when it was due out on April 1st. So a lot of delays associated with the census this year. And there are some other changes that are probably worth noting. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. How race was accounted for in the 2020 census was different than how it was done in 2010. It was different on the basis of what categories were available, and it made it much, much easier for Americans to choose a multiracial category. So you could be a white plus 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 other races. And so the data that came out, it looks different than it did. You probably just heard this earlier today, probably looks different than it did before, probably looks like there's fewer people who just check the white box and more people in the racial and ethnic categories plus the multiracial category. And then I also just want to mention the requirement that the Census Bureau has to protect the data that they receive from individual households. And they've changed how they do that this year from either suppressing some of the data so that it just wasn't all exposed, or swapping data between jurisdictions, to something called differential privacy. And data users in the redistricting world are concerned. Some are hair on fire concerned. Others are just saying, well, shoot, that makes our data less accurate, but oh, well, it's the best we've got. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think it's a little bit of a tangent. However, whether that differential privacy causes grief could easily show up in courts. My cat wants to join us here. Come on, mister. Come say hello. All right. So that's Boudreaux. Often comes when he hears my voice. So on that, I just want to be sure that it's clear that I wanted to be clear that it's totally unclear what differential privacy will mean for redistricting this year. And I do expect that there will be court cases on this. So I think with that, I have pretty much told you all of the things I had prepared, and I'm happy to take questions now or after Wayne talks. And I think he's going to really bring this to light, to bring this right to what you need to hear about Nebraska.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And folks, get your questions in, because I think you brought up a lot of topics we could go much deeper on, and you would be a great expert to do that with. I know in the last session, we did have questions about the race ethnicity question on the 2020 census being different than how they asked in the past. So there was more opportunity to identify different intersections of race and ethnicity. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more? Because it really did come up in the last session and we didn't get to that question, and then we'll throw it over to Wayne if you don't don't mind.
I can say a little bit more. Generally speaking, the Census Bureau doesn't do any changes to its processes without a huge amount of conversation with stakeholders and with testing things in the field. So throughout the early, let's say 2010 to 2016, how to ask race questions was very much front and center for the Bureau. And what they recognized, as probably everybody on this call does, there are simply more people who are multiracial than there were in, let's say, 1960. And somewhere along the way, having to choose a box for white or black didn't make any sense anymore. And that they created a much more complex process. So first you have to decide about your race. Oh dear, I might be mixing up race and ethnicity at this point, but there's non-Hispanic white as well as Hispanic white, and every other choice goes down below that. And then they've left many, many choices for people. So not only could you be African, but they would put the first most populous 6 nations that you could say, I'm Nigerian American or such. And then you could fill in the others. So if you were from Burkina Faso, I hope I even pronounced that correctly, you could write that in. So there's a lot more granularity in that data, which is helpful to understand who we are. But it did have the effect of making it look like the United States is less white than it used to be. And it is less white than it used to be probably, but this reporting process reinforced that, and it's a little hard to separate out which is the issue at hand.
That is exactly the questions that we were being asked, and thank you for addressing that. We have one more that came in, and I think Wayne will be able to speak to this too. Excuse me, Deputy Secretary Benna. But I'll ask, and then maybe we can transition. You mentioned that some states use guidelines, and we have a legislative resolution that was passed last spring that outlines some guidelines here in Nebraska. How binding are those guidelines from a legal perspective?
Well, gosh, I don't know. I'm going to say when you call it a resolution, you could probably have a resolution to undo it. And we certainly know that legislatures have resolutions to tell the federal government to have a balanced budget, and they have no binding power. So I think this is a better question either for Wayne or for one of the attorneys at the legislature. Having said that, in the last decade, it did seem to me that when guidelines were adopted by resolution or by committee, I don't know what else you would call it besides a resolution, they really did follow those.
Very good. Thank you so much.
You are welcome.
Folks, get your questions in. Wendy will be back with us here in a little bit. Next up, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections here in Nebraska, Secretary Benna, previously served as an election commissioner for Sarpy County. That gives him great insights at the local and state level for us. And we really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. You were with us for the last session too, so we'll be looking forward to your insights on those topics as well. But I think first up, you're going to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Nebraska on redistricting.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well done.
All right, there we go. Technology is great till it's not.
It didn't go. I don't think it went to presentation mode. You clicked it though, so you tried. From beginning right there should work. Just doesn't want to.
It's working on my end.
Oh yeah, I'm still seeing the presentation, like the presentation view. We'll be okay. We'll be okay.
We'll get there.
Yeah. Well, we can see the presentation, so that's a great start. Could you share the screen? Oh, do you have 2 different screens up? We've had that.
I have 3. I have 3 screens, so that's my fun is where I put this.
Right. So maybe stop your share.
Yeah.
Find the one you want us to see most.
Yeah.
And then share again. Thanks, Matt. I would make jokes right now, but I would
Yeah.
distract you. Did you hear my suggestion for any new
Yeah, and I'm
campaigns
doing
slogans
that.
this
The thing is, it's going to another screen. When,
Oh, all right.
yeah, so
Take your time. Or
Yeah.
bring that up. We could see the main points, and folks can absolutely adjust their
just give me a
screens.
second here. I think I know where to go now.
All right. I will remind everyone while you are doing that recordings will be made available in the coming weeks. We will send an email. I've also put the link to that website in the chat a few different times. Also, at the beginning of the last presentation, I put a link to our conference evaluation. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. We are eager to make sure we are providing great programming on topics of interest to you all. So when you get a chance, check those out. And that website will also host that conference evaluation link, as well as materials and resources from today, in addition to the recording. That's fine, as long as you didn't write anything in the notes.
I did not.
Oh, good. Someone's reminding us to go to display settings if you want to get rid of that. But if you want to just move along, I think we'll be fine. Sometimes I have notes that I don't want people to see.
No, there's no notes. So we'll just
All
go.
right.
All right.
We'll be okay. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, good morning. All right, technology is great till it's not. Okay, so again, my name is Wayne Betta. I'm Deputy Secretary of State for Elections. And it was my job to make sure that the elections last year went on as scheduled on the statutorily required date. So I didn't get to move any deadlines. And so just when I thought I was able to take a break, we found out in February that the Commerce Department, who's in charge of the Census Bureau, notified the states that the census data will be delayed until September 30th, 2021, from the normal statutory deadline of March 31, 2021. And so again, they blame the census. It was a 4-month delay in getting people out into the field, which necessitated a 6-month delay in the data coming out. This was not going to work for Nebraska. And so we worked very quickly with the Census Bureau and my other counterparts throughout the states to let them know that this was not okay. And we have a lot of statutory deadlines to meet in order to make the 2022 elections happen. And we needed this data faster. And so with a lot of pressure on the Census Bureau, we were promised legacy format data, which is by August 16th, 2021. And I don't know if David talked a little bit about this. What's the difference between legacy format data and the normal data that we've received? And when I was testifying to the legislature, I was trying to think about the best analogy, and consider your favorite book that you've read more than anything else in the entire world. You've read it hundreds of times. That's the data that's going to be released on September 30th, 2021. And that still hasn't changed from at this point. But what we were offered was legacy format data, which is the same data as the data that's going to be provided on September 30th, but just a little bit harder to read. So consider that book you've read 100 times. It's that same book, but every page is in a different foreign language. Now, it's still able to be read, but it just takes someone that has either the right software or that many different languages. So in talking with our state legislative GIS office, they were able, through their software, to be able to use this data. And so knowing that, I was able to then, knowing when we would get it and we'd be able to use it, I was able to create a timeline in order for our legislature, as well as our political subdivisions and our hardworking election officials across the state, to be able to meet those deadlines. So we were able to have elections in 2022 with new boundary lines, because the alternative was elections in 2022 without boundary lines, and that was a no-go from the start. We were going to try to get this done. So in order to accommodate this delay in the release of data, AM 1133 was proposed to LB 285. And 285 was a pretty innocuous election bill that I wrote. It was more of a cleanup bill. And we held it on select file. We have 3 rounds of debate in Nebraska for those of you that are new to our unicameral. And so it was held on select file waiting for this amendment to be proposed. Now, since there were so many new changes that I needed to do, it had to have a hearing in order to be able to be even introduced and amended onto any other bill. So AM 1133, which we'll talk about a little bit, was drafted by my team, I and my team here, and with the help of all the different political subdivisions and their input to make sure that we were hitting every one of the statutes, so we were able to have elections in 2022. So we'll go through a little bit about AM 133 and that little spoiler alert, that bill passed, and it passed unanimously and signed by the governor. And now these are going to be our new deadlines going into 2022. So what's going to have to happen is we did get the data 4 days early. So we were really, I know the Legislative GIS office was very happy about that. So they're doing their work behind the scenes to prepare the data to be able to use for the different maps that they're going to have to be able to do. And right now, from what we're hearing from the legislature is that there's tentatively scheduled to have their special session starting September 13th, going through September 30th, or whenever they get done, whichever comes first. The legislature will draw new district lines for the U.S. House of Representatives, their own districts in the legislature, the Supreme Court, Board of Regents, Public Service Commission, and State Board of Education. And after all those bills are passed, then those maps are then delivered to our office, so then we can then distribute them to the counties so they can begin their work. So AM 1184 to 285 changed the deadlines that different entities have to get their work done so we can have an election. So our hope is the legislature gets done drawing their boundaries by the end of September. At the bare minimum, we need the state legislative district boundaries. And why is that important? Once the legislature is done with their work, then those maps, the legislative precinct lines are sent to the counties. And the counties then begin drawing their precinct boundaries. And there's 2 rules in Nebraska in regards to drawing of precinct lines. And your precinct, again, for those of you kind of new to this, your precinct is then where your polling site is. And so everyone in that precinct goes to that polling site in order to vote. We have 2 rules in regards to precinct boundary lines. First, a precinct cannot cross a state legislative district. And then a precinct cannot have more than 1,700 polling site voters. So first, a precinct can't cross a state legislative district. It is the only political subdivision, state legislature, that won't allow 2 state senators to be at on the same ballot at a polling site for a precinct. Now that can happen in all other districts, cities, city council districts, county commissioner districts, et cetera. But state legislative districts in your precinct at your polling site associated with your precinct, you will only have 1 state senator race on that ballot. So especially in your big 3 counties of Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy, they're going to have to move their precinct lines to adjust to how the legislature is going to move the already existing lines. As David talked about earlier, Elkhorn's going to have to, that district's probably going to have to be shrunk a little bit because it has too many people. Those districts that are too small are going to have to be increased as well. There might have to be another district thrown into one of those counties based upon the statewide population totals. So those precinct lines, especially in the big 3, take quite a bit of time, especially depending upon where the state legislative districts, how they get moved. Also, we have a law that says a precinct can have not more than 1,750 voting voters at a polling site. And what that means is that you can have more than 1,750 people in that precinct, registered voters, but you can adjust for early voting or folks that do not vote. So it used to be in 2010 when I did this in Sarpy, what I figured is that the highest turnout you would probably have at a presidential general election is 85%. And of that, usually 25% vote early. So thus, you can think of 50 to 60% max is what's going to vote at a polling site on election day. So with that, you can adjust those precincts to be able to accommodate that. The less people you have, the less opportunity there would be for lines on election day or what have you. So it's up to each one of those election commissioners and county clerks to determine what's best for them in regards to how many people to actually put at the polling site, but no more than 1,750 for that. So counties will have approximately a month, October to November 1st, to get those precinct lines done, and then provide those lines to the political subdivisions within their counties so they can begin their work. The Secretary of State does have discretion in this bill to provide extra time for the counties to get this done under an unusual circumstance. And that's mainly going to be if the legislature goes late or something happens in their office, such as a COVID outbreak that stopped the work for a little while. But we're expecting the legislature to get done on time so we can be done on time on the county level. And so November 1st is when those precinct lines then get shared all the way to the cities. I think I may have figured it out. Are we looking a little bit better now, Josie?
Well done.
All right. Okay. So November 1st, political subdivisions will begin their work. So political subdivisions will then draw their district boundaries. And the easiest one that I can mention to you is a city and their city council districts that elect by ward. They're going to have to draw their new boundaries, one, to be population equal in regards to the one person, one vote initiative, but as well to follow precinct lines wherever possible. And the general rule is that you have two districts in the same precinct. Only in rare circumstances you want to follow those precinct lines, but sometimes a precinct is so big you have no choice. So you are allowed up to two districts. If it goes beyond that, there's going to have to be a real big special circumstance, or it doesn't follow into state law. For example, I had, when I was in Sarpy County, I had a precinct in which a city put 3 city council districts and kept having to tell them that you can't do this. And finally, I told this, they weren't understanding what I was saying. I said, think of each one of your districts as a color, yellow, green, purple, what have you. You can't have more than 3 district colors in a precinct. Finally, they got it. They had an emergency meeting 2 days before the deadline, and they were able to be able to move that. So you just don't want so many different ballots at a polling site. So you want to reduce the number of ways that your precinct can be split. That's why you try to have no more than 2. So one little quirk we have in state law is that the Power Review Board has to review all charter amendments for public power districts. And so they have a long period of review as well as public input in regards to any charter changes, which would be including of district lines. So we had to work with them to find a balance in between. We needed this stuff by the end of the year, as well as they could go through their normal review process. So for public power districts, they have until December 17th, 2021 to be able to provide their charter amendments to the Power Review Board for conditional approval. So that way they have a few weeks to be able to take a look at the work that the Power Review Board did, the public power districts do. But for Everyone else, including the Power Review Board, they have to have their boundary lines to the county election office by December 30th, and 2021. They don't get 1,000 years. I apologize for that typo. We'll get that fixed before it goes up, goes live. Although this last year's felt like 1,000 years, let me tell you. Also, the deadline for the Power Review Board to provide conditional approval for all charter amendments filed by December 17th, 2021. So the Power Review Board will have a special meeting giving conditional approval to make sure that they've done what they're supposed to. We'll still be able to have the public hearings after the fact before we have the election. Now, LB 285 was interesting because one of the changes that I was making anyway before we found out how late the census was going to be is we were going to move the filing start period from December 1st to January 5th. And why that was important is that we have a law that says that all the political subdivisions have until January 5th to tell us at the state as well as the counties what measures or what races will be on your ballot and who the incumbents are. And so for some races, counties didn't know what race was up on the ballot, which seat or who the incumbent was until January 5th, even though on December 1st, they had to start filing. So we wanted to match those up. So we can start the filing on January 5th, as well as the same deadline for any boundary adjustments to be made in effect for the 2022 primary election. And so while we said December 30th was the deadline for political subdivisions, we still again have this wiggle room that the Secretary of State can provide under extraordinary circumstance if the December 30th deadline could not be met. So if everything goes smoothly, by January 5th, we will have new lines on the state level. We will have them on the county level, on the local level. All of that will be back to the local election office. And we'll be able to start filing, people will be able to start filing for office starting January 5th. March 1st, that's actually the end of our filing period, but that is the deadline for the Power Review Board to notify the Secretary of State if any of the public power districts did not have their boundary maps approved. We don't expect any of them not to be approved, but this was allowing the Power Review Board to have the 3 months they needed to be able to finalize their process. And so May 10th, 2022 is the statewide primary. So once all these deadlines have been met, our county election officials will take all of these maps and then go into our voter registration system and make those changes in the voter registration system. So when you go to your polling site, you're going to get the right ballot with the right races of all the districts that you now live in because of the census and the boundary lines changing because of it. So that's what I have in regards to how we made the changes. Pretty much we cut all of the timelines in half than we normally would have. We have buy-in again from all of our political subdivisions, and our legislature passed the bill unanimously, signed by the governor. So I was really quite proud of the collaborative work that we did to make this amendment and this bill possible. Because, quite frankly, there's a lot of other states right now that are in a lot worse shape than we are. We cut our timeline in half, but we're encouraging all of our political subdivisions to work with a GIS vendor to help speed things along and help digitize the process. So this becomes easier each time the census comes around. So I appreciate the time to talk a little bit about the Nebraska experience, how we adapted to the changes in the census, and welcome to take any questions that you might have. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Folks, get your questions in. I don't know that we will have this great a group again assembled to talk about this extremely important and timely topic. I have some questions. I'm actually seeing some folks raise their hand on the attendees list. I'm going to ask you to just put your questions into the Q&A. I'm just worried that if we're turning mics on and off, we may end up with more technical issues than we want to manage in this short period of time, but we would love to hear those questions on the Q&A. First question we posed to Wendy as well, Deputy Secretary Benna. I'm going to get that. You mentioned, so we talked about resolutions versus law for the redistricting process. We have a legislative resolution here. To what extent is that binding, followed closely? How do we view resolutions here in this process?
So that is the map. I get a map to do the maps. So that's their guidelines in regards to starting the process. And so the resolution is no different than was 10 years ago. While I'm not a necessarily expert in what the legislature does, they would draw, the maps would be drawn to that resolution. And then could they be adjusted and voted without those? Yes. But then I think someone could have that they didn't follow their own resolution. There could be a legal battle, but I did not, even though it was very contentious 10 years ago, they still stayed within those population and those that differential.
Great. Wendy, you can turn your camera on if you're here with us. I think some of these questions coming through, you'll be able to answer as well. Staying on this topic of the resolution. So the resolution is guiding the Nebraska legislative districts. Is that same resolution apply for local communities who are in the process of redistricting?
That is the guidance that we give to our county, our political subdivisions, that they follow the same 5% differential.
Wendy, is that true in other places? The guidelines for the legislative resolution are similar for sub-districts, or do they sometimes have more flexibility or less? Do you know?
I believe that generally speaking, there isn't that kind of guideline given to local jurisdictions. And in fact, in many states, local jurisdictions that do have geographically bound districts in cities and such don't quite get it that redistricting law applies to them as well as it does to the state. So in some states, in Indiana and California come to mind, there's a cottage industry in suing cities and such for not having done redistricting for some length of time. So Nebraska's ahead of the game for sure in giving guidance to the locals on how to do that.
Great. Question came into the chat. What variation in population will be allowed in legislative contests? And can you, sometimes that terminology we use to describe that can be difficult to understand. So to the extent possible, can we break that down? And then to Wendy, how similar is that, the Nebraska guidance, to other states?
So if you want to look at what's the ideal population in a district, you take all of the people who live in the state, you divide it by the number of districts there are. So divide by 40 in Nebraska, and that's how big it should be. And I'm going to just say that means it's 100,000 people. I know that's not right, but whatever. So if there's sort of this assumption in in courts that you could go 5% above or 5% below if you're trying to, so that would be 95,000 to 105,000 would be the range that you'd want to hit, so that you could take into account rivers and reduce the number of splits for counties and that kind of a thing. Many states are silent on this. They just use that sort of rule of thumb that comes from federal law. That's a problem for them because it's actually not hard and fast if somebody wants to sue you because you were 4% over in some and 4% under in others, and they can show that you did that for political gain as opposed to meeting other legitimate redistricting priorities. You're still in hot water. But again, I'd say Nebraska is ahead of the game by identifying it for themselves. And I have seen some other states where it's 1 or 2%. So Nebraska is being kind of, I don't know, generous, but most states are saying nothing at all. And the state is just working with the general national assumption of plus or minus 5. And again, locals are usually given more leeway than the state is because they're working in a smaller area, and it's just that much harder to make those numbers work out.
Absolutely. Deputy Secretary Bennett, any comments on that? And I think it's just really important to understand that difference between a rule of thumb that we hope we don't get sued versus saying very specifically what that variation can be.
Yeah, and for the state legislative districts, the resolution is plus or minus 5. And so that's the guidance that is given to the locals as well. And then even for U.S. House in 2010, it was 0. And so I think they got it down to one voter between the three state legislative districts. There was a last minute shift. 20 years ago, there was a split of Cedar County and a split in Sarpy County. Sarpy was split in the legislative or U.S. House 1 and 2, and Cedar County between 1 and 3. And so to be able to get to that 0, they moved it into Dixon. So there's one little slice of Dixon County that was in 1 and 3 now. So it'll be interesting to see getting it down to 0. What gets split this time. We don't necessarily like the splits in the counties for U.S. House because, of course, we apportion our electoral vote by congressional districts. So it takes a little bit of work to be able to figure out how we're able to, what presidential votes are in one district versus the other. So our big preference would be no splitting, but it's still gonna have to happen this time around.
Building on that, someone said, will the Secretary of State's office send out notifications to people if any of their districts have changed? And I think like generally this process is kind of complicated and it's a lot of that data use, but for folks that are voting in precincts, in elections, how do they come to understand why it's changed? And how do they find that information to know if it's changed?
Yeah, and so while not required, we do tell our county election officials once they have finished all of their work, they can notify their voters by a new postcard. I know what I did in 2000, when I was the Sarpy County Election Commissioner, what I did in that primary right after was I sent everyone a letter letting them know what their new districts were. And on the other side of the letter was an early ballot application. And I said, you don't like your new polling site? Okay, well, you can vote early. And so that was my way of saying, well, I had to make these changes. I'm sorry you've been voting at that spot for 30 years, but changes had to be made. So each county can do what they feel is best for their community. But our website, the Secretary of State's website, has a link to what's called Voter View, and any voter can look up their information and see what districts they're in, as well as when it comes to an election, see what the status of their early voting ballot, whether or not the application has been received, they've been sent, or it's been given back. So the same information you can get on our Voter View site can tell you all your districts as well as track your early ballot. And some of our bigger counties have that on their own websites as well, the ones that have a little more resources and GIS technology. I know Sarpy, right before I left, we had that ability on our website, polling site locator, and also tells you what all the districts you live in.
Great, we'd be happy to link that too, because I know that is a question that comes up. We spend a lot of time talking about this process of redistricting, but then what that means for me when I go to the ballots, and being super informed about the decisions that go into elections.
Yeah, if I guess what I'll say is if your polling site changes because of, and the thing is with this process, the line might change and you're in a new polling site, or your polling site's going to be changed because they're trying to be ADA compatible or they couldn't use it anymore. So for the most part, especially in the bigger counties, if your polling site's going to change, you will be notified. So,
you know what, let's stay on that theme. We are getting some great questions, so we're going to have a lot to talk about. But you talked about the difference between precinct boundaries and sort of political subdivision boundaries. And mostly when we talk about redistricting, we are talking about those political subdivisions. So who we can vote for. But that precinct boundaries is also interesting too. And I know a lot of the smaller counties, that's almost a more sort of pressing question for them. And it has some rules around it. Specifically, we know it's two different data sources when we make those decisions about precincts and political subdivisions. Can you talk about that and maybe why we do that?
So, state law says, again, we can't have more than one legislative district in a precinct. So that was to make sure that a person wasn't given the wrong ballot and voted in the wrong race, and it affected the race. And I believe there have been instances before that law was passed that actually happened. And so that was the correction. So the counties can't even begin. They can start to do their work a little bit, especially in the rural counties when they know that their whole county is going to be in one district. The district might change, but they're less likely to be split, as in Douglas, Sarpy, and Lancaster, which definitely are split, and they're going to be moved around. So they can't start their work because that's the number one rule. So once we have the legislative districts, then they can build their precincts on top. And once they build their precincts on top, we recommend, if you don't have your own GIS vendor or GIS department to work with a vendor, they can then plot the registered voters that you have in the district on top of that to see how many people are in there. And so if you have too many, then you're going to have to adjust again. If you have too many voters at that precinct, you'll have to adjust, but also take in mind, don't cross the legislative boundary. So we just want to make sure there's not too many people voting at a polling site. So the lines are kept reasonable, but also to make sure no one gets the wrong ballot for state legislature.
Absolutely. So precinct boundaries based on registered voters, so you know where to go to vote, but political subdivisions, who you vote for, that is based on that 2020 census total population count.
Correct. Yep. And the political subdivisions outside of the ones the legislature does, they do their work after the precinct lines have been drawn.
Great. Wendy, here's a great one for you. How much input does the public have on the redistricting process?
Well, that is a good question, and the answer may depend on a few factors. I think I mentioned that the media has paid much more attention to redistricting throughout this decade, and especially now. And there are advocacy groups that have been working to educate their members or their followers on what redistricting is and what input they could have. So this decade is going to be unlike previous decades. I mean, and I think if you went back to 2000, there was very little public input. I mean, maybe if you wanted to go to a hearing, you could figure out where it was and show up and people would be surprised. And if you wanted to talk to your own legislator about what you thought would be good, you had the opportunity to do it. But last decade, this opening up started, and this decade, the gates are much more widely open. And there are people behind the scenes pushing, saying, go in and tell them what you want, tell them what you want. Now, in my opinion, your person on the street knows that their street was paved or not, but they don't really know a lot about what the boundaries would have to do with that. So they're probably getting some input from whatever the organizing group is that's helping them have their voices heard. And then there is this thing of community interest, communities of interest. And if you don't say that wheat farmers in the northwest corner share some commonality, would that make a difference? I don't know. But that's a new thing. Again, it's being pushed from advocacy groups. It is one of the few places where a plain old person on the street could say, give me that map, I'm going to draw what's my district, or not district, but my community of interest, with the hope that that would be maintained within whatever the districts were. So, and then I am wondering, there's the kind of public input that's window dressing, and then there's the kind of public input that actually impacts outcomes. And I think that the same things that are true for lobbying on any topic would be true for that. It's good if you have a relationship with your legislator before you go asking for something particular. It helps if you're fairly explicit. It helps if you can express what the issue is that makes you come up with that solution. So, and then everybody, and I just hope that that not only legislators know this, because they do, but that everyone else gets it too. At the end of the day, maybe you get some of what you want, maybe you don't get all of what you want, but maybe that's true for all the other people who are at the table. So it's not like a winner take all thing, like you only get one president out of a presidential election. You're going to give and take. You're going to get something here. You're going to take a little hit over there. So if the public wants to be involved, they have to get a little smart about what they can do. And then I don't know what the timeline is in Nebraska. It sounds like, since things are happening really fast, right this minute sounds like the right time to be putting in your input.
Great point. Let's stick with the topic of process. We have a lot of questions coming about that. But we do have we had a delayed release of the 2020 census data, so we are moving through much faster here in Nebraska. How might that impact that outcome or those opportunities for folks to get involved in the redistricting process? At all? Are we worried about it, or no, this is maybe has some positive benefits? I don't know.
I can say something if you want, but I don't want to stand in your way, Wayne, on that because it is sort of Nebraska special.
Yeah, I mean, there are still there has to be a hearing in each one of the congressional districts, excuse me, when the legislature does their work, as well as they'll have hearings in Lincoln in regards to doing their work. And then for most of the political subdivisions, in order for them to pass their new boundary lines, they have to have a resolution passed. And so there'll be opportunities for public input in regards to this. I don't think we have had to cut the deadlines, but we haven't cut the process in regards to be able to pass those. So the way I look at it is, while we've cut the timeline in half, a lot of that could have been fluff because you didn't get started right away, or you're like, oh, I'll do that after vacation. So we're pretty much saying, okay, do your vacation now, because once you get the data, there is no margin for error. So I believe there will be enough time for public input in regards to this. The more input, the better. But a lot of the time may not have been that we cut may not have been used in the first place. But public input is very important. But this is what we had to do to have elections in 2022, and I think most would agree. Having elections with new census data based upon the last census in 22 was the right way to go. So this is the way to get it done.
Fair point. What's the status of the national provision which prohibits the use of political data in Nebraska? And maybe talk about what is the political data that might be used in redistricting, and what is and why is that not supposed to be used? Yeah,
and so political data won't be used in the legislative process because they'll be using the census data, and the census data doesn't have the political information. They're going off this box. So that won't be used in regards to drawing those lines. And then for everyone else, the only time registered voter data is used is to make sure that the precinct lines or the precincts don't have too many voters. And that doesn't matter about political party, just has to do with the number of registered voters in the district. And when then those maps then go to the political subdivisions, they aren't to use that data as well to draw their lines, but they're using our precinct lines as boundaries along with their own boundaries of their own districts.
Josie, it's possible that the requester was interested in what's going on with Congress. So the House has passed H.R. 1 and the Senate is stalled on its version of that. And I'm at the 90% confidence level, not the 100% confidence level, that it says all states should do like Nebraska does and not use political data. And that data is things that help identify where the Democrats live and where the Republicans live. So in some states, voter registration is divided by or identifies party. That's not true in all states, but we have election results of who won governor's races, Senate races, presidential races. So you can sort of see where Democrats and Republicans live. So, and even you could say that knowing incumbent addresses is a form of political data. So that's the kind of data that I was thinking of that you all don't use on purpose, where other states think it's absolutely essential and you couldn't even begin to draw your first line without it. And I'm pretty sure that if that bill got through Congress, which I'm pretty sure it won't, then that would become a national standard and people would be flocking to Lincoln and Omaha to learn how you do it.
Oh, well, we love when that happens. A couple more procedural questions, and then we might get into some substance of that political aspect of redistricting and what that might mean for where and how people vote. For Deputy Secretary Benna, with the shift towards mail-in ballots, has that changed how the 1,750 folks that are supposed to be at a polling site are calculated in a precinct?
I will say it is a consideration, but I have recommended to our county election officials not to necessarily use last election year in regards to figuring that, because what we've heard is that because of the pandemic, people were going to be voting early, but people like their polling sites in Nebraska. And so we expect that as we all hope this pandemic will wind down by our next election, but be prepared for anything, that we will not see the level of early voting that we did. It will increase, but our general rule of thumb is I'm sticking to 25% is what you try to do. And I've told my election officials, don't go to 1,750. You don't want to go to 1,750 because that's too many people over 13 hours on election day. So you don't want 3,000 people in a precinct to get to just 1,750. You still try to make it 1,750, but you can use about 25% of early voting. Now, 10 years from now, we'll readjust that to see how over the next 10 years, how early voting starts to grow in Nebraska because of what we saw in 2020. But I think it's a little too early to think just because of what happened in 2020 means it's going to be more people will, but I don't think we're going to hit that 51% or that 60%, what we saw in the primary of people voting early. So last year was different, but sticking to the normal 25% is a good starting point for our counties.
Thank you so much. Here's a big one. And this comes from Rachel, who I assume is with the League of Women Voters in Nebraska, who has some great resources available on this topic on their website. We will link it somewhere a little bit later today. But does the principle of one person, one vote apply to both the congressional and unicameral maps? When the LR was debated on the floor, I assume here in the unicameral, it was argued that the principle did not legally apply to the unicameral, but only to the congressional map.
The Supreme Court in the 1960s had one case, and I'd love to tell you what it is, but I can't, that said it's true for Congress, and that's where it said as close as practicable to equal population, which is why congressional districts have been made to within one when at all possible. And then another case came through that was on the legislative side, and it also said, yes, you do need to look at one person, one vote, but that's where they put a little more wiggle room in to allow the plus or minus 5. I'm not saying that the Supreme Court said plus or minus 5, but they said instead of as close as practicable, I think it was as close as, or with it, I don't know, it had some other words with a little bit more wiggle room in them. So.
Yeah, I don't have much more beyond what Wendy just said, so.
We just had another question come in. Does the previous history of redistricting in Nebraska indicate that the prohibition on using political data has been observed in practice?
I don't know how to answer that, Wayne. I can see you're thinking about it too. I guess when I think about states, I think of Nebraska as being less contentious than New York or Pennsylvania or Ohio or Wisconsin. And I guess less contentious means maybe this hasn't been sort of tried. I mean, maybe, but you had mentioned that there was contention last decade, and I don't know what that contention was about. Was that political? Like, did people think that there was still, even without using political data, some benefit to one of the two major parties?
I think probably what the questioner is talking about is the flipping of Sarpy County. So 20 years ago, the map looked like it was now. 10 years ago, it got flipped. 30 years ago, it looked like now. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, in 2010, it flipped from what it was in 2000 of where so take a Sarpy County here and here, they flipped one and two of what it was in one and what was in two. So there was a lot of contention in regards to that, but it was what it was 10 years earlier before. And so I know because they only use census data, the legislature doesn't have access to that data. Do people make those inferences? Yes, absolutely. Does politics possibly play a role? Possibly. But what I know is the legislature doesn't have those numbers in drawing of the maps. So whatever is done during negotiations of those maps is beyond what I've had to do. We just do what we're told. So our election officials just take the maps that they have. We always say laws, like, you don't want to see how laws are made and sausage is made. I've seen how sausages are made. I would rather just stick to sausage. So.
Yeah, and so I do think they're asking about this idea that the resolution says we are going to use population totals. And while we don't have any very specific principles, compactness and contiguity, that those are things we try for. Yet we do know that folks have access to partisan data. It's a fairly small state. People are aware of how people sort of live and are trending and are moving. And the census data does give us race ethnicity data, which is certainly not partisan data, but it can sometimes be a good proxy for it. So we would love for it to be not based on all of those factors, but we know that they come in some way. Maybe taking Nebraska out of it and throwing it to Wendy. How do those things factor into the process in practice as compared to maybe what we hope for?
It's absolutely true that Democrats at the national level are lined up to try to encourage states to draw maps that will be favorable to Democrats. And it is absolutely true that Republicans at the national level are lined up to try to encourage state legislators to draw maps that are favorable for them. And neither one of them makes any bones about it. That's their job. So maybe in Nebraska, they stay out. I don't know. Maybe they give some hints that just what you read in the newspaper might tell you where things are changing. I mean, that kind of political data isn't hidden when we know where the precincts that voted for President Trump or for Biden were. So you could have it in your mind, even if you don't have the data on the map. Does that make sense? So that you could use it to informally. But I do want to say that there's a lot of other pieces at play in addition to D's and R's. And some of them are, I want the district where my kid goes to high school. That's not about D's and R's, that's personal desires. And I know that legislative leaders do want to know what's of interest to their members. If there's room to meet those needs of the members, they will. And obviously not everybody's needs get met, but there could be a lot of personal things as well. I heard that whatever the big sports stadium is in LA got divided, and it was big enough it could be divided into 4 parts. So 4 legislators could say that they represented whatever that stadium is. So there are a lot of other things in play too, besides D's and R's. Race, as you pointed out, can be used as a proxy for politics. That's changing, though. It is not what it used to be. So don't count on that. And then another thing that in other states, redistrictors are trying to do is not only make a good map for today, but a map that's going to stand the test of 10 years, because the same maps will be used, knock on wood, for 10 years of elections. And so let's say the D's and the R's got so clever that they made maps that were really great for them now, but then demographic change continues to take place, or the candidates who are fielded by the parties are unusual in some way, or just the tone of the nation changes. They might have maps that are good for 1 or 2 election cycles, but then find themselves, oops, it flipped. So if you try to be too clever, you sometimes lose out in the second half of the decade. So yeah, politics is there. I don't know how it works in Nebraska, but it's there in virtually all the other states. And but it has to fit into many other considerations as well. I hope that was on point for the question.
Absolutely. And I want to explore how those changing demographics might impact the redistricting process here a little bit more. But I do have to think one of the big differences, and tell me if I'm wrong because I wasn't here, between 2010 and 2020 is the analytic capacity that we have now, right? To use and apply the data. We could create many maps of any district where maybe we didn't have the power to do that before. And just to the extent you think that's impacting the process here in Nebraska and elsewhere. I think it might be democratizing the process a little bit more, right? Everyone can make their own maps and share, but how else might it be impacting how we're operating today?
So Wayne, if you don't mind, I'll go first and then you can bring it home for Nebraska. So there are a couple of ways where data analytics are making a huge difference, even between 2010 and 2020. And one of them is the capacity for people to make their own maps. And I talked about that there are several systems out there. Redistrictor is another one I didn't mention. There's another thing though, and I think this might be where you're heading, Josie. There are mathematicians in our nation who will be taking every map that gets submitted, at least for congressional and legislative maps, and running it through a program where they'll compare that map to hundreds of maps, thousands of maps, possibly even millions of maps. And what they've done is they can take the state of Nebraska and they can slice and dice literally thousands of times, and I believe truly millions of times, and make that many maps. And then they see what are the characteristics of each of those maps. And let's just take D's and R's, but that doesn't have to be the only thing that they could measure. And then they make a bell curve of all of those millions of potential maps. And then they take the one map that's into consideration, they put it against that bell curve. And if it's way at the D or the R side, you can make the inference, not the direct connection, that that map was made with political intent, or it could be racial intent, or it could be, we could also be measuring how close it is to equal population for each of the districts. So that capacity wasn't there before, and there are people, not only does it exist, it's functioning right now. And that concept could be used in advance. And I think this would be true in some, the Illinois of the world, where the legislature would be running it through processes like that before they sign off on a map, before it becomes something that's released to the public, because they don't want to be at the tail end of the bell curve. And it'll definitely show up in court, and it did begin to show up in court in the last couple of years. In Pennsylvania, for instance, that was a significant part of the evidence that was submitted. So yeah, data processing is, we know it'll be bigger than it was before, and we don't know if it'll be utterly determinative. So somewhere in between impactful and utterly determinative is where I'll land on that. And again, I don't know if in Nebraska we're going to see that either at the drawing side or the going to court side. I don't think of you as being a state that people battle over in the same way they do in some other places, but maybe I'm missing some fine points there.
You know, I think 2010 was the first time we saw a real big, battle in the legislature over the lines. And maybe because of technology, that was with the start, because everyone could build their own map. I had heard 2010 was my first redistricting year. And so, I remember going to our JIS folks, I guess it'd be great if we could just put on a wall, screen. I envision you can put on a screen and the computer program, and here's the legislative lines, and let's draw precinct lines, and we can geocode the registered voters so I know, and then we can move lines to make sure that I'm making all these things. I really wish we had that technology in my JS. People like, yeah, we can do that. Because I'd always heard these horror stories before of just lines and pieces of paper or what have you, and some of our counties still do that. And so going through that in 10 was very beneficial, because I knew all of my precincts were going to be legal. And then it was great for us, my county at least, to do that. And so that's why we're recommending all of our counties work with a vendor this time around to take the pencil and paper out of it, to make sure you are going to be within all of the guidelines. There could be an unintentional violation because you're just doing pen and paper because you don't know any better. And so our hope is that most of our counties will be using a vendor GIS technology to be able to create better maps. But did technology and the wider use of the technology going forward? Yeah, because you're not going to just rely on a few people to do maps. Every senator can do their own maps. And so that's where collaboration is going to come into a huge play this next session. So
we are a vendor for some of those, and I will say we've seen some 2010 maps that were drawn And, you know, a fat highlighter is very confusing. If you are going to draw, use a pencil, a fat highlighter, you get both sides of the street, so you don't know where to cut it. In the last presentation, David did an amazing job summarizing some of the big demographic shifts and the connection between the 2020 census and the process that kicks off of redistricting. It's so important to understand how that redistricting process is intended to reflect those changes, right? That's why we do this every 10 years together. So the big ones for Nebraska, we are increasingly more diverse compared to other states. I would not say we are very diverse, but we are increasingly more diverse, particularly among our younger population. We have increasing urbanization, actually more so suburbanization. That's where our growth is. We do have many rural counties losing population though, so we do know how they're shifting around the state. We're not bringing a ton of people here, but we are still growing through natural change, but we are an aging population as well. So that's how I would summarize what's happening in Nebraska. I think the question is, how robust is our process, our redistricting process, our elected officials that will be doing this to us, in their ability to draw lines that reflect those changes? Will our lines reflect how we've changed our demographic shifts? And I know there should, but what are we doing to make sure that's true?
So, you know, I'm not probably the foremost expert in regards to that, because we just take all the lines from the voting perspective and just get it done. I will say is community feedback is important in regards to those issues, as well as, you know, when you look at demographics, urban, rural, what we're seeing is, you know, as we contemplate where the lines are going to go, we're going to see state legislative, probably a district from out in central and western Nebraska going into where the population is shifting. So a lot of it is population based for sure. In regards to everything else, population is the first one person, one vote. But you also don't want to, I hate to use the gerrymander word, you don't want to gerrymander folks in and out of districts as well. And so that's why a lot of public input is important in regards to this, so they know what's important to the community. So I think these officials need to rely on vendors that know what the law is and to tell them what the obligations they have and what a certain map would do and would it face legal scrutiny. So
What do you think nationally?
I'd say that what you described in Nebraska is largely true for the rest of the nation. More diverse, more people in suburbs and cities, but more especially suburbs. Rural counties are definitely shrinking throughout the nation. And I guess the last two, not a lot of growth and aging process, are not necessarily true throughout the nation. Maybe I would say that with those last two features, not a lot of growth, maybe that means not a lot of change is needed. So you could start with the existing maps perhaps and alter a little bit. What I'm envisioning is that if you need to make the western districts larger so that you can eventually, you'd like just add a little territory and then add a little to the next one, add a little, and then that would get you what you need. I don't know if that really would work, but it seems as though everybody could just move a little bit to the east to be able to add what you need to. But maybe part of this is a messaging question. So rather than thinking about this is done for politics, this is done for population. And when you see the population numbers, you understand that it's not taking power away from the western rural counties, it's distributing power based on where the population has moved. The legislature is not in charge of who moves where, they're responding to it. So maybe I might not quite get that message right here, but if we could tie the changes that are about to come to that demography and have presentations like what you had earlier today and news articles about that, so people understand that the population did change and therefore we have to have some change that follows right along. Maybe that's a helpful way to think about this.
Thank you both so much. We do still have some questions coming in. I will probably send them to you to ask, but I bet everyone wants to go to lunch. So thank you both for being here. Thank you all for tuning in this morning. That is the third of 4 sessions in the Nebraska Data Users Conference Series for 2021. Someone wants to come to my door. If you're not already registered for October 28th, we would appreciate you joining us. I am going to put the link one more time in the chat to everyone for the evaluation. We really appreciate you doing that, and we really appreciate you spending the morning with us. Hope to see you all soon in person one day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.